My name is Waylon. I am 68 years old, and I recently learned that the most dangerous predators do not hide in the dark. They sit at your Thanksgiving table. At exactly 8:18 in the morning, my Platinum credit card was declined while I was buying a simple black coffee. I handed the card back to the cashier at the local diner. I asked her to swipe the magnetic strip again. The machine flashed the same bright red denial code. The young woman behind the counter gave me a look of deep, sympathetic pity. That look burned more than the hot coffee ever could. I did not cause a scene or raise my voice. I simply placed a crisp $5 bill on the laminated counter from my money clip. I told her to keep the change and walked out the glass doors into the biting Chicago wind. I stood beside my vintage truck and pulled my phone from my heavy canvas jacket. I dialed the number for my son DeAndre. The line rang twice before the call connected. I asked him clearly and calmly why my primary spending account was currently locked down. I expected to hear that the bank had flagged a fraudulent charge. I expected a mundane banking error. I did not expect the betrayal that came next. DeAndre answered the phone on speaker mode. The ambient noise of his luxury kitchen echoed through the receiver. He did not sound concerned or apologetic. He sounded annoyed by my interruption. He bluntly informed me that he had canceled all of my cards that very morning. Before I could process his statement, his wife Heather interjected. Heather is a white woman who has always carried an air of unearned superiority. Her voice dripped with arrogant condescension. She told me that I was getting too old to handle my own money. She claimed my recent purchases proved I was suffering from senile decline. DeAndre agreed with her completely. My own son confidently stated that they had assumed full control of my entire financial portfolio for my own good. Heather added the final crushing insult. She instructed me to call them and ask for permission before I spent another single dime. They wanted to reduce a grown man to a dependent child begging for an allowance. They spoke to me as if my brain was already decaying. They expected me to surrender my independence without a fight. They assumed I would simply accept this hostile takeover out of confusion or fear. DeAndre told me to go back home and rest. He promised they would drop off a small cash stipend for my groceries later that week. Then he abruptly disconnected the call. I did not shout into the dead phone. I did not throw my device onto the frozen pavement. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath of the freezing morning air. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs, but I forced my muscles to completely relax. I climbed into the cab of my vintage truck and gripped the cold leather steering wheel. I spent 40 years managing massive, volatile commercial construction sites across the unforgiving landscape of Chicago. During those 4 long decades, I successfully handled aggressive union strikes, corrupt material suppliers, and sudden catastrophic structural failures. I learned a fundamental truth in the dirt and the concrete. Panic builds absolutely nothing. Screaming only reveals your emotional weaknesses to your enemies. Strategy is the only thing that builds and protects empires. I turned the ignition key. The heavy engine roared to life with a steady, reliable hum. I shifted the truck into drive. I did not head back to my empty house to rest as my arrogant son had commanded. I steered my truck directly toward the towering skyline of the financial district. I arrived at the main branch of the First National Bank exactly 20 minutes later. The polished marble floors and high vaulted ceilings usually brought me a profound sense of security. Today, the opulent building felt like an active battleground. I deliberately bypassed the standard teller lines and walked straight toward the glass-enclosed office of the regional branch manager. The manager was a man I had known professionally for over 15 years. He looked up from his computer monitor and his face instantly turned pale. He stood up nervously and quickly closed his office blinds. I sat down in the leather guest chair across from his large mahogany desk. I kept my voice entirely even and impeccably polite. I instructed him to print a comprehensive statement of my primary checking accounts, my corporate holding accounts, and my private retirement funds. The manager swallowed hard and actively avoided making direct eye contact with me. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair and adjusted his collar. He apologized profusely but stated that he could not comply with my simple request. He told me that his hands were completely tied by the corporate legal department. I asked him to explain exactly what legal authority could possibly block a man from viewing his own money. The manager looked at me with a mixture of fear and deep professional regret. He firmly refused to print the financial ledgers. The room fell completely silent. The manager slowly opened his top desk drawer and pulled out a thick legal file. He slid a crisp white document across the polished wood toward me. I picked up the paper and read the bold heading. It was a medical power of attorney. I scanned the paragraphs detailing severe cognitive decline and irreversible memory loss. At the bottom of the final page rested a signature from a licensed physician declaring me legally and medically incompetent to manage my own affairs. The manager quietly explained that DeAndre had arrived at the bank as soon as the doors opened that morning. My son had presented this certified medical document to the legal department. Acting under the immediate authority of the forged proxy, DeAndre had successfully frozen every single one of my accessible liquid accounts. He had legally stripped me of my financial independence in less than an hour. I stared at the physician's signature on the fraudulent document. I had not seen a doctor in 8 months. I had never met the man who signed away my freedom. This was not a simple misunderstanding or a misguided attempt to help an aging parent. I realized instantly that this was a highly coordinated, premeditated legal attack designed to steal the wealth I had spent a lifetime building. DeAndre and Heather had fired the first shot. They had drawn blood. Now it was my turn to respond. I drove away from this bank with a singular objective crystallizing in my mind. Panic was a luxury I could not afford, and anger was a useless distraction. I needed the original foundational trust documents securing my assets to counter the fraudulent medical proxy Jordan had filed. I steered my vintage truck through the familiar tree-lined streets of the neighborhood I helped develop 40 years ago. Pulling up to my property, I noticed Megan's pristine white luxury SUV parked aggressively across the center of my driveway. I parked on the street and walked up the cobblestone path. The morning air felt sharp against my face. I stepped onto the porch and slid my brass key into the deadbolt of the heavy oak front door. The key slid halfway in and stopped. I tried again, applying a fraction more pressure. The internal pins refused to align. The lock had been entirely replaced. A fresh scratch on the brass faceplate confirmed the recent tampering. My son and his wife had not only stolen my financial autonomy, but they had also actively locked me out of the home I owned. They believed a new piece of metal would keep me away from my own history. They were operating under the foolish assumption that an architect and master builder could be locked out of a structure he designed. I withdrew my useless key and slipped it back into my pocket. I did not ring the doorbell. I did not pound my fists against the heavy wood. I simply turned away from the front porch and walked quietly down the side path toward the detached garage. The side yard was completely shielded from the street by a row of thick evergreen shrubs I planted decades ago. I approached the utility door of the garage. It was a solid steel frame without a visible keyhole designed to look like a simple service panel. Jordan and Megan surely assumed it was permanently sealed from the inside. They lacked the mechanical curiosity to question how things actually worked. 10 years ago, I wired a hidden magnetic bypass switch into the exterior brickwork for emergencies. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my heavy metal money clip. I pressed the flat edge of the clip against the third brick from the bottom right corner of the door frame. A faint mechanical click echoed from behind the steel. The heavy magnetic lock disengaged instantly. I pushed the door open and stepped into the cool, dark space of my garage. The familiar scent of motor oil and aged wood greeted me. I moved with practiced silence, my heavy work boots making absolutely no sound against the concrete floor. I crossed the garage and unlocked the interior door, connecting to the main utility room of the house. I slipped inside my own home like a ghost. The ambient noise of the household immediately washed over me. I could hear heavy footsteps moving across the hardwood floors above, and the shrill sound of a voice echoing down the main hallway. I remained entirely motionless in the shadows of the utility room, calculating my next move before stepping into the light. I looked down the long corridor leading to the main living area. I did not just buy this house. I poured the concrete foundation with my own bare hands. I framed every wall, hung every heavy oak door, and laid the intricate hardwood flooring specifically to Sylvia's exact tastes. This house was a tangible manifestation of the life I built for my late wife. I knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which air vents carried sound between rooms. My mind effortlessly mapped the complex electrical routing and the load-bearing supports hidden behind the drywall. Jordan claimed my brain was decaying and deteriorating into senility to justify his theft. Yet I stood in the shadows holding the exact blueprints of this massive structure perfectly intact within my memory. The irony was profound. The man they legally declared incompetent knew the structural integrity of their stolen fortress better than they ever would. Every nail and beam was a testament to my enduring cognitive sharpness. I used that intimate knowledge to navigate the hallway without disturbing a single creaking floorboard. As I approached the edge of the living room, Megan's voice pierced the air. She was standing near the grand staircase, aggressively barking orders at two hired movers in gray uniforms. She pointed a manicured finger toward the antique mahogany dining set occupying the formal room. That dining set was Sylvia's prized possession, completely restored by hand over 3 painstaking years. Megan loudly instructed the men to break the table down and throw the pieces into the rented dumpster outside. She explicitly complained that the dark wood was outdated and ruined the aesthetic of the modern home gym she planned to install by the weekend. Watching her casually destroy my late wife's beloved legacy sent a sudden wave of fierce heat rushing through my chest. The urge to step forward and confront her was incredibly strong. But confronting her would ruin my strategic advantage and result in a useless shouting match. I forced my breathing to slow and completely detached my emotions from the scene. I turned my back on the destruction and slipped quietly into the adjacent home office. I walked directly to the heavy Persian rug covering the center of the room. I rolled the thick fabric back, revealing a seamless panel in the oak flooring. I pressed the hidden latch, lifting the wooden cover to expose a heavy steel floor safe. Jordan and Megan had spent hours replacing the locks on the doors, entirely unaware of the titanium vault resting right beneath their feet. I spun the metal dial of the safe, entering the combination with rapid, precise movements. The heavy steel door clicked open. I reached inside and retrieved a thick leather binder containing the original irrevocable trust documents governing my entire estate. I zipped the heavy legal binder safely inside the inner pocket of my canvas jacket. I lowered the floor panel and smoothed the Persian rug back into its exact original position, leaving absolutely no trace of my presence. I moved silently out of the office and navigated toward the back kitchen door to make my exit. As I passed the massive marble island in the center of the kitchen, a brightly colored piece of mail caught my eye. It rested on top of a stack of opened envelopes. The red border across the top of the paper indicated an urgent final warning. I paused and leaned closer to inspect the document. It was a formal commercial loan default notice issued by a major downtown lending firm. I scanned the terrifying figures printed on the page. The outstanding debt was massive, totaling over $2 million. My eyes darted to the bottom of the legal notice. Resting right above the dotted line was a perfect forgery of my own signature acting as the primary financial guarantor for the loan. Jordan had not just frozen my accounts to steal my cash. My son had illegally leveraged my entire life's work to finance a catastrophic debt, and the deadline for payment had just expired. I folded the commercial loan default notice and slid it into the inner pocket of my canvas jacket right next to my foundational trust documents. I retreated through the utility room and exited the garage with the exact same silent precision I used to enter. 10 minutes later, I was merging onto the interstate, heading straight for the towering glass and steel structures of the downtown financial district. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with a cold and singular focus. I parked in the underground VIP garage of a premium high-rise building and took the private elevator directly to the 42nd floor. The polished mahogany doors of the executive law firm opened immediately for me. I bypassed the front reception desk and walked straight into the corner office of my corporate attorney, Bradley. He was a man who commanded absolute authority in any courtroom he entered. Bradley looked up from his dual monitors and instantly recognized the gravity of my expression. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I pulled the heavy leather binder from my jacket and set it securely on his desk. Then I retrieved the fraudulent medical proxy and the commercial loan default notice. I placed both documents flat on the polished mahogany table directly in front of him. I told him that my son and his wife had just declared war on my life. I needed him to show me exactly how deep the financial bleeding went. Bradley picked up this default notice and adjusted his glasses. His eyes scanned the terrifying red figures printed across the top of the page. He immediately turned to his computer and began typing rapidly into his encrypted legal database. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed a series of restricted financial networks to trace the origin of the massive debt. It took him less than 10 minutes to uncover the entire scope of their deception. He turned his monitor around to show me a series of heavily redacted corporate filings. DeAndre and Heather had not simply frozen my personal checking accounts to steal my liquid cash. They had aggressively leveraged my entire private estate to secure a $2 million commercial loan. The funds were completely funneled into a desperate attempt to save Heather's failing high-end art gallery. Her vanity business had been hemorrhaging money for 3 consecutive years due to her terrible management and obsession with elite status. Instead of admitting defeat and closing the gallery, she convinced my son to commit massive corporate fraud. They used the forged medical proxy to bypass the standard banking security protocols. They essentially mortgaged the very foundation of my life to pay for imported champagne and meaningless abstract sculptures. Bradley pointed to a specific clause buried deep within the digital contract. The loan was extremely high risk. It required my active and verified signature guarantee every single financial quarter to remain legally valid and active. Bradley did not just view me as another wealthy client on his corporate roster. 20 years ago, he was a brilliant but completely broke young man working night shifts on one of my roughest construction sites. I recognized his fierce intelligence and relentless drive immediately. I quietly paid his entire tuition for a prestigious law school without ever asking for a single penny in return. I treated him like the son I always wished I had. Our loyalty to each other was absolute and entirely unspoken. Watching the blatant betrayal executed by my actual biological son ignited a cold and terrifying fury in Bradley's eyes. He loosened his silk tie and cracked his knuckles. He viewed this attack on my livelihood as a deeply personal insult to his own family. He looked at the forged signature on the default notice with pure, absolute disgust. He assured me that he was going to dismantle their entire operation piece by piece. He promised to make them feel the full weight of the legal system they arrogantly thought they could manipulate. He told me he would show no mercy to anyone trying to destroy my legacy. I instructed Bradley to focus entirely on the vulnerability he found within that quarterly signature guarantee clause. DeAndre and Heather had built their entire financial house of cards on the assumption that I would be locked away in a memory care facility, completely unable to challenge their forged documents. I told my attorney to shatter that foundation immediately. Bradley opened a secure channel directly to the senior legal department of the downtown lending firm that issued the massive loan. He drafted a blistering formal declaration of identity theft and gross financial fraud. The document explicitly stated that I was in full possession of my mental faculties and that my signature on their commercial loan was a verifiable forgery. We formally and aggressively revoked the financial guarantee securing the $2 million debt. Bradley attached a certified copy of my original irrevocable trust to prove my absolute legal authority over the estate. He typed with surgical precision, ensuring every single legal loophole was permanently closed and sealed. We were not going to negotiate with my son, and we were certainly not going to offer him a chance to explain himself or beg for a compromise. We were going to cut the life support line to Heather's failing vanity project and watch it completely suffocate under its own impossible weight. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city skyline while Bradley finalized the devastating legal strike. Bradley hit the send button with a forceful, satisfying tap of his keyboard. The highly encrypted email vanished from his screen and flew directly into the high-priority inbox of the commercial lender. We sat in the quiet luxury of his office and waited for the inevitable fallout. It took exactly 10 seconds for the digital shockwave to strike its target. The heavy silence was abruptly shattered by the violent vibration of my cell phone resting on the mahogany desk. The screen illuminated brightly, displaying DeAndre's name in bold black letters. The phone rang loudly, echoing off the glass walls of the office. The bank's automated security systems had functioned flawlessly and instantly. The moment Bradley's revocation was registered, the lender had issued an immediate and catastrophic automated loan recall to the primary account holders. DeAndre and Heather had just received a terrifying notification demanding the full repayment of $2 million. The phone stopped ringing for a fraction of a second before immediately lighting up again with another frantic call from my son. The arrogance and absolute superiority he had displayed on the phone just a few hours earlier had completely evaporated. He now knew that I was not a confused old man wandering aimlessly through the city. He realized the financial umbilical cord he relied on had been brutally and permanently severed. The phone continued to buzz relentlessly across the polished wood. I did not reach out to answer it. The financial war had officially begun. I watched my cell phone vibrate across Bradley's polished mahogany desk. DeAndre's name flashed repeatedly on the screen. I did not reach out to answer it. I picked up the device and silenced the ringer completely. Letting a desperate man panic in a vacuum is a highly effective strategy. I thanked my attorney for his rapid execution of the legal strike and left the towering glass office building. I navigated my vintage truck through the congested downtown streets toward a premier luxury hotel overlooking the river. I did not use my frozen personal accounts to secure a room. I booked a premium corner suite utilizing a deeply buried corporate holding account that DeAndre and Heather fundamentally lacked the financial literacy to uncover. I handed my keys to the valet and walked into the expansive marble lobby. I ordered a hot black tea from the concierge and took a seat in a high-backed leather armchair near the grand fireplace. I unfolded a daily financial newspaper and began reading the market reports. I needed a neutral ground to dictate the pace of the inevitable confrontation. I intentionally left my cellular location tracking active. I knew my son possessed the technical tools to pinpoint my exact physical coordinates. I wanted him to find me. I wanted to force him to face me outside the safety of his stolen fortress. I took a slow sip of the hot tea and waited for the predictable storm to violently breach the quiet elegance of the lobby. Exactly 40 minutes later, the heavy brass revolving doors of the hotel lobby spun open with aggressive force. DeAndre and Heather marched across the pristine marble floor. They completely ignored the polite greetings of the hotel staff. DeAndre looked entirely frantic. His designer suit jacket was unbuttoned and sweat beaded noticeably along his hairline. Heather walked a half step ahead of him, projecting a cold aura of manufactured authority. They were not alone. A tall man wearing a bespoke tailored suit and a condescending smile flanked them. Heather immediately pointed a manicured finger in my direction. DeAndre stormed over to my leather armchair and demanded to know why the bank had just issued a catastrophic loan recall. I calmly folded my newspaper and told him that financial fraud carries severe legal consequences. Heather quickly interrupted her husband before he could publicly admit to the forgery. She drastically shifted her tone, attempting to sound like a deeply concerned caretaker in front of the surrounding hotel guests. She announced that my recent actions proved my cognitive state was rapidly deteriorating. She gestured to the tall man standing beside her. Heather loudly introduced him as a highly respected medical specialist. She claimed they brought the doctor here simply to ask me a few standard questions to ensure my physical and mental safety. The man pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and stared at me with an invasive, calculating gaze. I observed the supposed medical specialist standing before me. I recognized his distinct features instantly. I possess an eidetic memory for faces and structural blueprints. I had seen this man featured prominently in a local high society magazine just 2 months prior. He was absolutely not a board-certified neurologist or a geriatric specialist. He was an incredibly expensive cosmetic plastic surgeon who operated a controversial boutique clinic catering to the wealthy wives of the suburban country club set. He was deeply embedded in Heather's privileged social circle. This revelation exposed the precise nature of their weaponized network. Heather was leveraging her affluent white connections to effortlessly manufacture false legal authority over a successful African-American man. She assumed I lacked the social capital or the fundamental awareness to challenge a man wearing a $5,000 suit. She believed her country club associations granted her absolute immunity from basic medical ethics or standard legal scrutiny. I understood immediately that this man was brought here to sign a secondary evaluation to solidify their fraudulent emergency conservatorship petition. They needed another documented layer of lies to satisfy a judge. I did not expose his fraudulent credentials or demand they leave the premises. I decided to give them the exact performance they desperately needed. I slipped my hand into the side pocket of my canvas jacket and blindly engaged the audio recording application on my cellular device. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly and relaxed my facial muscles to project a facade of exhausted vulnerability. The plastic surgeon leaned in closer and began asking me incredibly basic questions about the current date and my recent whereabouts. I answered him with deliberate, slow hesitation. I feigned mild confusion regarding the passage of time. I intentionally mixed up the details of my morning schedule. DeAndre watched my performance with a sickening look of profound relief. He truly believed his father was finally breaking down under the immense pressure. Heather smirked triumphantly. She encouraged the fake doctor to continue pressing me on my financial memory. She wanted me to verbally admit on record that I lacked the capacity to manage my own vast estate. The surgeon confidently asked me if I remembered where I kept my most valuable assets. I let a long, heavy silence hang in the air between us. I stared blankly at the intricate patterns of the marble floor to ensure the recording clearly captured their hushed, eager breathing. The fake doctor pressed the question again, speaking to me as if I were a toddler. I was successfully feeding them enough rope to hang themselves completely on a verifiable digital audio file. I looked up at Heather with widened eyes mimicking genuine senile anxiety. I leaned forward and lowered my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I told them that I was incredibly worried about the hidden wall safe located behind the drywall in the basement utility room. I fabricated a story about securing Corinne's remaining collection of flawless, unmounted diamonds inside that specific vault years ago. I stated that the diamonds were worth over $500,000 and that I could not remember the combination to the mechanical lock. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely predictable. Heather's eyes widened with unchecked voracious greed. DeAndre completely forgot about his impending $2 million loan default. The prospect of untraceable liquid gems hijacked their rational thought processes. Heather abruptly interrupted the cosmetic surgeon in the middle of his next diagnostic question. She loudly declared that I was clearly exhausted and needed immediate rest. She aggressively dismissed the fake doctor, telling him they had gathered enough evidence for the court petition. DeAndre did not even bother to say goodbye to me. They spun around and sprinted out of the hotel lobby toward their vehicle. Their overwhelming greed had completely consumed them. They were rushing back to my house to tear down the basement walls with their bare hands to find a treasure that did not exist. I stopped the digital audio recording and secured the device back inside my heavy canvas jacket. I picked up my porcelain cup and calmly finished the last drop of my hot black tea. They had just abandoned their strategic legal assault for a mirage. Now I had the exact leverage I needed to execute the next phase of their absolute financial destruction. I sat in the hotel lobby for exactly 5 minutes after my son and his wife sprinted out the revolving brass doors. I wanted to give their blinding greed enough of a head start. Right now, DeAndre and Heather were likely speeding down the interstate, completely consumed by the illusion of finding $500,000 in untraceable diamonds hidden behind the drywall of my basement. They were currently destroying the utility room with sledgehammers, chasing a ghost I had planted in their minds. I left my empty porcelain teacup on the table and walked out to the valet. I tipped the attendant with a crisp bill from my money clip and climbed back into my vintage truck. I merged into the afternoon traffic and steered away from the suburbs. I navigated toward the Gold Coast, the most affluent and exclusive shopping district in the entire city. The streets here were lined with imported luxury vehicles and designer storefronts catering to the ultra-wealthy. I found a parking spot directly across the street from a sleek minimalist building featuring expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. A tasteful backlit platinum sign hung above the entryway displaying the name of Heather's high-end art gallery. I turned off the engine and sat in the cab of my truck for a moment. I watched wealthy patrons wearing $1,000 coats walk through her polished glass doors. Heather desperately wanted to belong to this world. She was willing to steal my life to fund her illusion of elite status. I stepped out of my truck into the brisk wind. It was time to shatter that illusion completely. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the gallery and stepped inside. The air conditioning was perfectly calibrated, and a faint scent of expensive cedar and white tea filled the massive room. I immediately looked up at the ceiling and then analyzed the load-bearing walls. My eyes are trained to see the skeleton of a building before I ever register the superficial decorations. Heather had made aggressive alterations to the space. She had recklessly removed a central support pillar to create an open-concept viewing area for her oversized abstract sculptures. She had also exposed the original brickwork on the eastern wall, severely compromising the moisture barrier I had installed 2 decades ago. These were not cosmetic updates. These were highly dangerous, unauthorized structural modifications that jeopardized the integrity of the entire building. A young assistant wearing a tailored black suit and a wireless earpiece quickly approached me. He looked down at my scuffed leather work boots and my heavy canvas jacket with an expression of barely concealed disgust. He assumed I was a lost maintenance worker or a confused pedestrian wandering off the street. He stepped directly into my path and aggressively asked if I was looking for the delivery entrance in the alleyway. He informed me that this was a private viewing hour for premium clients only. He firmly gestured toward the exit, attempting to physically usher me back out the front doors. I did not move a single inch. I looked at the young man and told him to step aside before he found himself unemployed by the end of the day. The assistant scoffed at my warning, completely unaware of the reality of the ground he was standing on. People like Heather and her employees only respect the appearance of wealth. They respect the designer labels and the imported sports cars. They entirely dismiss the quiet, calloused hands that actually built the concrete foundations of their pristine world. When my commercial construction company became highly profitable 30 years ago, I did not buy a fleet of flashy vehicles. I poured every massive profit margin into a private, heavily encrypted real estate holding corporation. I legally shielded my identity behind layers of corporate attorneys and anonymous trust names. Heather writes a massive rent check on the first of every single month to a faceless corporate entity listed on her commercial lease. My daughter-in-law has absolutely no idea that the holding company cashing her exorbitant rent checks belongs entirely to the black father-in-law she so deeply despises. She assumed I was just a retired laborer living on a fixed pension. She never possessed the business acumen to research the actual owner of her flagship gallery. The assistant reached for his radio to call for building security. I completely ignored him. I reached inside the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a thick, legally binding document prepared by my attorney Bradley just a few hours prior. I bypassed the stunned young man and walked directly to the pristine glass checkout counter located in the very center of the gallery. I slapped the heavy legal document face up on the glass with a loud, resounding smack that echoed sharply through the quiet room. Several wealthy patrons stopped sipping their complimentary champagne and turned to stare at the sudden commotion. The document was a formal, non-negotiable commercial eviction notice. It explicitly cited severe and catastrophic breaches of the commercial lease agreement due to grossly negligent and highly unauthorized structural modifications. It legally demanded the absolute vacation of the premises within 48 hours pending a full municipal safety inspection and structural audit. I looked at the young assistant. His face had suddenly drained of all color as he read the bold legal print and recognized the certified corporate seal of the holding company. I instructed him to call his boss immediately and tell her that her landlord had just permanently shut down her vanity project. I turned around and walked out of the gallery with my head held high. I left the terrified assistant staring at the legal destruction of his workplace. The financial guillotine had officially dropped. I stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk just as a speeding white luxury SUV aggressively pulled up to the valet stand. Heather threw her car door open and sprinted toward the gallery entrance. Her clothes were covered in gray drywall dust, and her face was flushed with a mixture of absolute exhaustion and furious rage. She and DeAndre had clearly spent the last hour tearing apart my basement with sledgehammers only to find empty space. We locked eyes through the heavy glass doors of the gallery just as she rushed inside. I watched from the sidewalk as her assistant frantically handed her the eviction notice. Heather read the bold legal text. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she realized the faceless corporation she rented from was enforcing a catastrophic breach of contract. Her wealthy clients watched in stunned silence as her curated facade completely shattered. Heather lost all composure. She screamed in pure, unadulterated humiliation, her shrill voice vibrating through the thick glass of the storefront. She pointed a shaking finger at me standing on the sidewalk and screamed that she was going to completely destroy my life. She aggressively pulled her cell phone from her designer handbag and immediately dialed the local police precinct. I could read her lips as she frantically spoke to the dispatcher. She was maliciously filing a fabricated police report loudly claiming that I had suffered a violent senile episode and stolen her highly valuable diamond jewelry during my confused rampage. She was escalating the war to the criminal justice system. I walked back to my luxury hotel suite and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plush carpet as I replayed the chaotic events of the day in my mind. My son and his wife were currently tearing apart the basement walls of my home looking for non-existent diamonds, completely unaware that the real weapon was already pointed directly at them. Exactly 45 minutes after my return, 2 sharp knocks echoed against my door. I opened it to find 2 local police detectives standing in the hallway. They flashed their metallic badges with somber expressions. The lead detective informed me that they were responding to an urgent grand larceny report filed just 20 minutes prior by Heather. He stated that my daughter-in-law had officially claimed I suffered a severe senile psychotic episode during which I broke into her possession and stole a collection of highly valuable heirloom jewelry. The detective stepped into the entryway without waiting for a formal invitation. The lead investigator explained the gravity of the accusations hanging over my head. He stated that stealing valuable property during a mental breakdown provided overwhelming legal grounds for Jordan's emergency conservatorship petition. They warned me that cooperating fully and turning over any missing items would make the impending psychiatric hold significantly easier on my dignity. They looked at me with a mixture of professional skepticism and thinly veiled pity, assuming an elderly man had finally lost his grip on reality. They were completely blind to the trap they had just walked into. I did not panic, raise my voice, or display any sign of defensive guilt. I maintained absolute physical composure. I gestured for them to take a seat on the velvet sofa while I walked over to the mahogany desk where my laptop rested open. I did not offer excuses or yell about conspiracy theories. I simply looked the lead detective in the eye and asked him if he would like to review the actual security footage before drafting his official arrest report. I did not have to search far for the truth of what was happening in that household. I remained seated and calm while the detective stared at me in quiet confusion. I explained to them that the jewelry Heather claimed I stole actually belonged to my late wife, Corinne. I told them that 3 months ago I noticed valuable pieces slowly disappearing from the master bedroom jewelry box shortly after Heather visited the house. Instead of confronting them and starting a screaming match, I trusted my instincts and took silent, strategic action. I did not bother arguing my character or shouting about my innocence. I knew that in the face of legal accusations, human words are entirely worthless unless backed by undeniable physical proof. I had spent 40 years building commercial structures where a single miscalculated measurement brings down a whole building. I applied that exact same rigorous standard to protecting my own life. I did not accuse my children of theft until I had captured every single second of their greed on a permanent digital record. I turned the laptop screen toward the detectives and pressed play on a high-definition date-stamped video file from the hidden camera I installed inside my bedroom. The ambient light in the hotel suite dimmed as the glowing screen illuminated the faces of the two investigators. The video footage began with crystal clarity. The timestamp indicated a Tuesday afternoon 2 months ago. The bedroom door opened, and Heather stepped into the frame, glancing nervously over her shoulder to ensure she was completely alone. She walked straight to my dresser, popped open the hidden velvet compartment, and began sliding Corinne's diamond necklaces and gold bracelets directly into her designer handbag. Her face projected cold, calculated greed without a single trace of hesitation or remorse. She zipped her bag shut, smoothed out her designer dress, and exited the room just as quietly as she entered. The video played for a full minute, capturing every angle of the theft in devastating detail. The detectives watched the screen in absolute frozen silence. The aggressive, accusatory posture they wore when they first walked through my door completely vanished into thin air. The lead detective slowly closed his leather notebook as the video looped back to the beginning. He cleared his throat, his face flushed with professional embarrassment at having been used as a pawn in a malicious family conspiracy. He looked at me and stated clearly that they were dropping all larceny inquiries against me immediately. He stood up from the sofa, zipped his jacket, and informed me that they were officially opening a brand new felony investigation into Heather for filing a false police report, perjury, and grand theft. They apologized for the inconvenience before hurrying out of my suite to intercept my daughter-in-law before she could spin another lie. I closed my laptop lid and leaned back in my chair. The first line of defense had held firm. The criminal charges against me were erased. Now it was time to dismantle the rest of their fraudulent empire. As the detectives exited my hotel suite to hunt down my daughter-in-law, the reality of her fabricated police report crashed down upon her husband. DeAndre was standing in the ruined basement of my home, surrounded by broken drywall and shattered illusions of hidden diamonds. His cell phone vibrated violently against his leg. Heather called him in an absolute panic from her vehicle. She frantically explained that the local police were no longer looking for me. They were actively searching for her to execute an arrest warrant for grand theft and filing a malicious false report. She also screamed that the holding company had just permanently evicted her failing luxury art gallery. Facing total financial ruin and the immediate threat of his wife going to prison, DeAndre completely abandoned logic. The massive commercial loan recall from the bank was ticking down like a bomb. He needed liquid cash instantly to avoid his own federal fraud charges. Desperation drove him to make the most reckless legal maneuver of his entire life. He dropped his sledgehammer on the concrete floor and sprinted to his car. He drove recklessly down the interstate directly toward the county courthouse. He bypassed standard legal channels and burst into the clerk office. Utilizing the forged medical proxy signed by the disgraced country club plastic surgeon DeAndre, filed an aggressive emergency petition for total and immediate financial conservatorship over my life. He demanded absolute control of every single asset I possessed. 2 hours later, I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window in my hotel suite watching the afternoon traffic crawl along the avenue below. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the quiet atmosphere. I opened it to find a uniformed legal courier standing in the hallway holding a thick manila envelope. He asked me to confirm my identity and handed over the sealed packet. I walked back to my desk and opened the heavy legal filing. DeAndre had managed to convince a duty judge to fast-track his fraudulent petition based on the fabricated medical emergency. The paperwork commanded me to appear for a mandatory emergency conservatorship hearing at 9 o'clock the very next morning. I scanned the attached financial demands. DeAndre was not just trying to reinstate his access to my frozen checking accounts. His legal filing explicitly targeted my massive private pension fund and the protected corporate retirement portfolios I had built over 40 years of construction development. He intended to seize millions of dollars in highly protected liquid assets to instantly cover his defaulting commercial loan and pay for Heather's impending criminal defense lawyers. He was trying to drain the lifeblood of my legacy to plug the massive holes in his sinking ship. I placed the court summons flat on the mahogany desk and immediately dialed the direct number for my corporate attorney. The final battle lines had just been drawn on official government parchment. Bradley arrived at my hotel suite less than an hour later carrying his own heavy leather briefcase. We sat across from each other at the small dining table to review the absurd legal filings. Watching my own son attempt to legally rob me forced a bitter memory to the surface of my mind. When DeAndre was a teenager, he constantly took dangerous shortcuts and made reckless decisions. He crashed a stolen car when he was 17, and I quietly paid off the damages to keep him out of the juvenile detention system. I bailed him out of minor legal troubles and shielded him from the harsh consequences of his own arrogance. I believed I was protecting my son, but I realized now I was actually building a monster. My past leniency had forged his current massive sense of entitlement. He fundamentally believed that I would always absorb the impact of his failures. He thought he could steal my entire life, and I would simply step aside and allow it to happen without a fight. I looked at Bradley and made a silent, firm vow. There would be absolutely no more leniency. The shielding was permanently over. Bradley reviewed the forged medical proxy attached to the court summons with a look of pure predatory anticipation. I asked him if we should file an immediate injunction tonight to block the hearing before it even started. Bradley shook his head and slapped the paperwork down on the table. He advised me that stopping the hearing now would only give DeAndre a chance to retreat and regroup his failing forces. We needed to execute a strategy that would permanently destroy his ability to ever challenge my autonomy again. Bradley explained that we must allow the emergency hearing to proceed exactly as my son intended. We could not present our hidden camera video or our financial evidence to the judge prior to the actual court session. We needed to let DeAndre walk into that courtroom and confidently take the witness stand in front of a live audience. We had to give him the unbroken opportunity to present his fabricated medical documents directly to a sitting judge. We needed my son to raise his right hand and swear a binding legal oath to tell the absolute truth. Once he was firmly established on the public record, Bradley would let him weave a massive, verifiable web of lies. By allowing DeAndre to testify under oath, we were actively transforming his desperate grab for cash into a severe and inescapable felony offense. We were setting a flawless legal trap and leaving the bait right in the open. The next morning, the sky over the city was a deep, bruised gray. I wore a tailored charcoal suit and walked through the heavy metal detectors of the county courthouse with perfect posture. Bradley walked one step behind me, carrying a single unmarked folder. As we approached the heavy wooden doors of the assigned courtroom, DeAndre stepped out from the shadows of the corridor. He looked completely exhausted, but his face was twisted into a mask of pure, arrogant cruelty. He aggressively stepped into my path and blocked my way to the courtroom entrance. He did not ask how I was feeling or apologize for the relentless attacks. He leaned in close and delivered a vicious, calculated ultimatum. He told me that I had exactly 2 minutes to surrender my pension funds quietly and sign the transfer documents he held in his hand. He promised that if I forced him to go inside that courtroom, he would ensure the judge locked me away in a miserable state-run medical facility for the rest of my natural life. He threatened to strip away my dignity and leave me rotting in a sterile room until the day I died. He thought his intimidation tactics would break my spirit right there in the hallway. I did not flinch or break eye contact with the boy I used to carry on my shoulders. I looked directly into his desperate, greedy eyes, and I simply smiled. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom sealed shut behind us, cutting off the ambient noise of the bustling courthouse corridor. The emergency conservatorship hearing officially commenced under the harsh fluorescent lights of the sterile legal chamber. DeAndre confidently walked to the front of the room and took his seat in the witness stand. He wore a perfectly tailored Navy suit designed to project the image of a responsible and deeply successful young executive. He placed his hands on the wooden railing and delivered a highly rehearsed, tear-soaked monologue directly to the bench. He painted a devastatingly tragic picture of a brilliant father completely losing his grip on reality. He described my fabricated mental decline with the practiced cadence of a seasoned stage actor. He claimed that the master architect who built skyscrapers was now a danger to himself, wandering blindly through the city streets. DeAndre paused his testimony to look across the room and point a trembling finger directly at me. He feigned a choked sob, acting as though the sheer weight of his fabricated grief was physically crushing him. He swore to the court that stripping away my fundamental human rights was the absolute hardest decision he had ever been forced to make. He presented himself as a selfless savior stepping in to protect his broken father from financial ruin. I sat entirely motionless next to Bradley, watching my son effortlessly weaponize his own father's dignity for a quick cash payout. DeAndre reached into his sleek leather portfolio and produced the pristine white medical document that served as the entire foundation of his legal attack. He handed the heavily notarized folder to the bailiff, who formally submitted it to the court record. My son leaned into the microphone and explicitly identified the paperwork as a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted just 24 hours prior. He spoke the name of the affluent country club plastic surgeon, falsely presenting the man as a leading neurological specialist. The prosecuting attorney asked DeAndre to verify the exact circumstances surrounding the creation of the document. DeAndre raised his right hand and swore a legally binding oath under the penalty of perjury. He confidently stated that he was physically present inside the hotel lobby during the entire medical consultation. He swore on the public record that he personally witnessed this esteemed doctor conduct a rigorous cognitive examination on me. He boldly claimed that he sat right next to me, while the physician definitively diagnosed me with advanced and irreversible dementia, resulting in severe financial incompetence. He stated that the doctor warned him my condition was catastrophic and required immediate total financial intervention to prevent me from bankrupting the family estate. He looked the judge dead in the eye and lied with a terrifying sociopathic ease. He was cementing his own fabricated reality into the official government transcript, entirely unaware that he was sealing the heavy iron doors to his own prison cell. The presiding magistrate sitting high above the courtroom was Judge Harrison, a notoriously strict and meticulous adjudicator known for his absolute intolerance of legal theatrics. He possessed a razor-sharp mind that valued hard, verifiable evidence over emotional manipulation. He watched DeAndre wiping away fake tears with a crisp white handkerchief. DeAndre completely misread the silent, heavy atmosphere of the courtroom. He foolishly believed that his polished charisma and Heather's quiet weeping from the gallery were successfully swaying the magistrate's judicial opinion. My son fundamentally misunderstood the brutal, uncompromising nature of the legal system. He thought a courtroom operated exactly like the country club charity galas Heather frequented, where superficial charm and a confident smile easily bypassed basic scrutiny. He assumed the judge would simply glance at the expensive letterhead of the medical proxy and grant him absolute control over my multi-million-dollar pension fund out of sheer pity. DeAndre was so blinded by his desperate need for liquid cash to pay off his massive commercial loan default that he failed to recognize the cold, calculating scrutiny radiating from the bench. He had no idea the judge was already dissecting his performance. Bradley slowly stood up from the defense table and buttoned his suit jacket. He did not carry a single piece of paper with him as he casually approached the witness stand. The heavy silence in the courtroom amplified the sound of his measured footsteps. Bradley looked at DeAndre with the quiet, predatory focus of a seasoned trial lawyer moving in for the absolute kill. He politely asked my son to confirm the exact timeline and location of the medical evaluation. DeAndre confidently repeated his fabricated story into the microphone. Bradley took a step closer and asked him to explicitly verify the medical credentials of the examining physician for a second time. DeAndre aggressively doubled down arrogantly, stating that the doctor was a highly decorated specialist at the absolute top of his respective field. Bradley leaned his hands on the wooden railing of the witness box, closing the physical distance between them. He asked DeAndre a third and final time if he fully understood that he was currently speaking under the binding, irrevocable oath of perjury. He gave my son one last microscopic window to retract his statements and save his own life. DeAndre sneered at my attorney. He fiercely confirmed the absolute validity of the medical proxy, and the physician who signed it loudly demanding that the court stop wasting time and grant the emergency conservatorship immediately. The steel trap had officially snapped completely shut. Bradley turned his back on my son and walked directly toward the towering wooden bench. He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a single heavily stamped legal document. He handed the paper up to Judge Harrison, formally entering it into the official court record. Bradley clearly and loudly announced that the document was a certified expedited affidavit obtained directly from the state medical board just 3 hours prior. The atmosphere in the courtroom instantly shifted from quiet observation to electric, dangerous tension. Bradley turned to face DeAndre, his voice ringing with cold, devastating authority. He informed the entire courtroom that the man who supposedly diagnosed my catastrophic dementia was not a neurologist, nor was he currently allowed to practice medicine in any capacity whatsoever. The certified state affidavit provided undeniable concrete proof that the country club doctor had his medical license permanently and irrevocably revoked exactly 2 years ago. The state board had stripped him of his credentials following a massive federal conviction for running a highly illegal prescription fraud ring out of his private clinic. Bradley looked directly at the judge and plainly stated that DeAndre had just committed multiple counts of felony perjury by submitting a fraudulent medical evaluation signed by a disgraced, unlicensed criminal. DeAndre's arrogant sneer completely evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared at the certified document, actively destroying his entire life. The atmosphere inside the sterile courtroom shattered with the force of breaking glass. DeAndre stared down at the certified medical board affidavit resting on the wooden railing of the witness stand. His jaw went completely slack and his polished veneer evaporated into a mask of pure terror. The paper in his shaking hand proved undeniably that the man he claimed was a top-tier neurologist was actually a disgraced and unlicensed criminal. Judge Harrison leaned forward over the towering mahogany bench with eyes like chips of flint. The magistrate did not ask a polite question. He demanded an immediate and precise explanation for the blatantly forged signature submitted to his court. DeAndre opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked frantically toward the gallery where Heather sat frozen in her designer dress. She offered absolutely no support and actively shrank back into the wooden pew. The judge raised his voice, warning my son that his silence was currently acting as a direct confirmation of felony perjury. DeAndre stammered a pathetic excuse, claiming he simply hired a consultant and had no idea the medical license was revoked. He was desperately trying to backtrack and shield himself from the legal avalanche, but he had already sworn under oath that he personally sat through a rigorous medical examination. He had trapped himself in a lie so massive and documented that escape was mathematically impossible. Bradley did not allow my son a single moment to catch his breath or spin a new fabrication. My attorney calmly approached the clerk desk and requested permission to submit a supplementary digital file directly into evidence. Judge Harrison granted the request with a sharp nod of his head. Bradley connected a secure digital cable from his encrypted smartphone directly into the central audio system of the courtroom. He pressed a single button on his screen. The crisp and undeniable audio recording I captured in the hotel lobby flooded the chamber through the overhead speakers. Every person in the room clearly heard Heather loudly declaring that they had gathered enough evidence for the court petition before hastily dismissing the fake doctor. The entire courtroom listened as DeAndre eagerly agreed and rushed her out the door to go hunt for non-existent diamonds. The audio explicitly proved that no medical examination ever took place and that my son colluded with a fraudster to manufacture a legal crisis. DeAndre gripped the edges of the witness stand as his own recorded voice betrayed him completely. The absolute arrogance he displayed while talking to the fake plastic surgeon played back like a horrific confession. The heavy silence that followed the recording was absolute and suffocating. The prosecution and the bailiff stared at my son with pure professional disgust. He had weaponized the justice system for personal greed, and the system was now turning its massive gears directly toward him. I sat at the defense table and watched the absolute destruction of my only child. A deep and heavy ache radiated through the center of my chest. I remembered holding him when he was a newborn baby and promising to give him a better life than I ever had. But sitting in that cold room, I also remembered the relentless and exhausting work ethic of my late wife, Corinne. She spent decades standing by my side, managing our chaotic ledgers late into the night while I poured concrete in the freezing rain. We built our entire commercial empire through sheer discipline and uncompromising honesty. Corinne always warned me that giving DeAndre too much unearned wealth would ultimately rot his character from the inside out. I could not allow the legacy she sacrificed her life to build be liquidated to fund my son's corrupt and criminal lifestyle. The pain of watching him fall was immense, but the duty I owed to my wife and the empire we forged together was infinitely stronger. I kept my face entirely impassive and watched the scales of justice balance themselves. Judge Harrison did not require any further testimony or deliberation. The magistrate struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a violent crack that made DeAndre physically flinch. The judge spoke with a cold and devastating fury that resonated through the chamber. He officially dismissed the emergency conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice, ensuring it could never be filed again. He looked directly down at my son and stated that exploiting the legal system to steal from an elderly parent was one of the most repulsive acts of cowardice he had ever witnessed from the bench. The judge then turned to the armed bailiff standing by the door and ordered him to temporarily detain DeAndre in the holding cell adjacent to the courtroom. He officially and publicly referred the entire case file, including the forged medical proxy and the digital audio recording, directly to the district attorney. He commanded the state prosecutor to immediately open a comprehensive criminal investigation into my son for multiple counts of felony perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward and placed their hands firmly on DeAndre's shoulders. They physically removed him from the witness stand and marched him out a side door. Heather covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly in the gallery, realizing her husband was now a documented criminal suspect. DeAndre was held in the concrete cell for 3 agonizing hours while the preliminary paperwork was processed. He was eventually released on a mandatory criminal summons pending the formal grand jury indictment. He stumbled out of the heavy brass doors of the county courthouse looking completely broken and disheveled. His designer suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant swagger he possessed just that morning had been entirely erased. Heather walked several paces away from him, refusing to even hold his hand. As my son walked down the wide concrete steps toward the street, his cell phone vibrated aggressively inside his breast pocket. He pulled the device out and stared at the illuminated screen. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he read the critical alert flashing across his display. The commercial lending bank had been officially notified of his massive legal and financial fraud by my attorney. The automated banking system had just executed the catastrophic loan recall. The digital notification plainly stated that his accounts were entirely frozen and that he owed the bank $1.2 million in exactly 48 hours. The alert contained a severe final warning that failure to provide the liquid funds immediately would result in a direct referral to federal authorities for massive wire fraud. DeAndre stood paralyzed on the courthouse steps, realizing he had just traded his entire life for absolutely nothing. DeAndre stood paralyzed on the concrete steps of the county courthouse, staring at the devastating financial alert glaring on his phone screen. The catastrophic commercial loan recall demanded $1.2 million in exactly 48 hours. If he failed to produce the liquid funds, the bank would immediately transfer his file to federal investigators for massive wire fraud. The fabricated emergency conservatorship petition had just been violently dismissed by Judge Harrison, leaving them absolutely no legal avenue to seize my protected corporate pension funds. DeAndre and Heather were entirely out of options and staring directly at federal prison sentences. Terrified of impending incarceration, they decided to bypass the judicial system entirely and execute a wildly desperate criminal maneuver. They retreated to Heather's luxury vehicle and frantically devised a plan to liquidate my primary physical asset behind my back. They decided to sell my residential home in an immediate emergency cash sale to cover their massive defaulting debt. They calculated that a rapid off-market property liquidation would generate enough untraceable capital to satisfy the aggressive commercial lender before the district attorney could formally indict them for felony perjury. They were no longer simply trying to manage an elderly father they deemed incompetent. They were actively attempting to fence a multi-million-dollar property like a stolen television set to save their own skins. They drove away from the courthouse completely consumed by their own sheer panic and reckless criminal desperation. DeAndre and Heather returned to my property and immediately contacted a highly aggressive private real estate broker known for facilitating extremely fast cash transactions. They brazenly utilized the original forged medical power of attorney to establish their false legal authority over the estate. They foolishly assumed that a hungry real estate agent chasing a massive commission check would not rigorously verify the medical standing or cross-reference the legal legitimacy of the disgraced country club plastic surgeon. They authorized the broker to bypass standard public listing protocols and market the house exclusively to private high-net-worth investors seeking immediate turnaround deals. They aggressively priced the estate at a severe discount to guarantee a rapid cash offer within their 48-hour window. I was sitting in my hotel suite drinking a glass of iced water when my secure digital tablet chimed with a high-priority notification. I utilize a specialized property monitoring software that tracks any municipal or commercial activity linked to my specific address. I opened the application and saw a premium real estate listing featuring high-definition photographs of my own living room and kitchen. My son and his wife had successfully pushed the listing live to an exclusive network of international property flippers. They were actively broadcasting their desperate fire sale to the wealthiest predators in the city. I stared at the screen, watching the digital view count climb rapidly as eager buyers circled the heavily discounted property. I sat in the quiet luxury of the hotel suite and methodically scrolled through the digital photographs displaying every corner of my home. I did not just purchase that property from a corporate developer. I mapped the architectural blueprints at my kitchen table late into the night while my wife slept. I personally poured the thick concrete foundation, mixed the mortar, and framed every single load-bearing wall with my own two hands. I laid the heavy slate roof and meticulously installed the oak flooring specifically to match Corinne's exact creative vision. Every square inch of that structure represents my physical sweat and our shared family legacy. Watching my son actively attempt to liquidate my architectural masterpiece to pay for his wife-imported champagne is the ultimate undeniable test of his complete moral decay. He was treating my life work like a disposable asset. It confirmed that the boy I raised was entirely dead and gone. Letting them try to sell the home they did not build is a necessary crucible. I needed to see exactly how far they would push their criminal entitlement before the heavy trap completely crushed them. The sharp ringing of my cell phone broke the heavy silence of the hotel room. Bradley called me directly from his downtown office. His voice crackled with intense professional urgency over the secure line. My attorney had also triggered the real estate alert and saw the fraudulent listing actively circulating through the premium broker networks. Bradley strongly urged me to file an immediate emergency injunction to forcefully halt the illegal property sale before a buyer could place a massive cash deposit into an escrow account. He wanted to deploy a swift legal strike to lock the property title and drag DeAndre back into court for another round of severe public humiliation. I listened carefully to his aggressive tactical advice, but I firmly refused to authorize the injunction. I instructed Bradley to stand down completely and let the fraudulent listing remain actively visible on the open market. I explicitly told my attorney to let my son successfully find a wealthy cash buyer and negotiate the final purchase price. I wanted DeAndre and Heather to proceed all the way to the official closing table, completely undisturbed. Stopping them right now would only cause them to retreat and search for another desperate avenue of escape. Letting them sit down at a formal title agency to sign highly illegal real estate transfer documents would permanently seal their federal indictments without any hope of a plea deal. We needed them to believe they had successfully outsmarted the entire system. DeAndre and Heather spent the entire afternoon frantically fielding calls from their aggressive private broker. The severely discounted price of the luxury estate functioned exactly like fresh blood in a tank full of starving sharks. Within 6 hours of the initial digital listing, they secured an extremely aggressive overseas cash buyer representing an anonymous international development firm. The buyer was completely indifferent to the strange circumstances of the rapid sale and was more than willing to overlook standard residential inspection periods in exchange for the massive financial discount. The overseas investor formally agreed to wire the entire purchase amount and close the complex transaction in exactly 24 hours. DeAndre signed the preliminary digital acceptance contracts using his fraudulent medical power of attorney. He firmly believed he had just engineered the perfect invisible escape hatch. I monitored the digital signature alerts through my holding company portal, watching him gleefully lock himself into an inescapable federal trap. DeAndre and Heather celebrated their perceived victory inside my stolen living room, drinking expensive wine and congratulating themselves on their superior intellect. They were absolutely convinced they had successfully liquidated my personal legacy to pay off their catastrophic commercial loan default before the bank could notify federal prosecutors. They thought they had finally outrun the brutal consequences of their massive greed. They had absolutely no idea they were simply marching happily toward a concrete brick wall at maximum speed. The overseas cash buyer stood on my front porch and processed the chaotic scene he had just witnessed. Heather was still breathing heavily from her vicious screaming match, and DeAndre looked entirely defeated. Despite the fabricated structural nightmares I had just presented and the highly unprofessional meltdown from my daughter-in-law, the overseas investor remained fiercely committed to the property. He firmly agreed to proceed with the official closing the very next morning, but he absolutely refused to budge on his massive $600,000 price reduction. DeAndre desperately accepted the devastating financial haircut because he had absolutely no other viable options left on the table. As I drove my vintage truck away from my own home, I watched my son immediately pull his cell phone from his pocket. He dialed the commercial lending bank with shaking hands. DeAndre used the guarantee of the impending cash injection from tomorrow's real estate closing to aggressively beg the loan officer for a strict 24-hour extension on his catastrophic loan recall. He promised the bank that a massive wire transfer was already queued up in a reputable escrow account. He firmly believed that if he could just keep the bank executives at bay until the following afternoon, he could finally escape the crushing weight of his federal fraud charges. He was desperately patching the holes in his sinking ship, completely unaware that I was already driving downtown to launch the final torpedo. I navigated the busy downtown streets and parked my truck in the underground VIP garage of the First National Bank corporate headquarters. This was the central hub where all major commercial lending decisions were finalized and aggressively enforced. I walked through the heavy revolving doors into the expansive marble lobby. I completely bypassed the long lines of ordinary customers waiting for the standard tellers. I ignored the low-level managers sitting in their glass cubicles and walked directly toward the restricted private elevator reserved exclusively for executive staff and premium portfolio clients. A young security guard stepped forward to intercept me, but he stopped immediately when he saw the absolute determination radiating from my posture. I rode the elevator to the top floor and stepped into the quiet luxury of the executive suite. I did not ask the administrative assistant for an appointment. I walked straight down the plush carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the chief loan officer. The executive was sitting behind a massive desk reviewing a stack of digital portfolios. He looked up with a start, ready to reprimand whoever had dared to interrupt his afternoon workflow. His stern expression instantly melted into a look of profound professional shock the second he recognized my face. I stepped into his office and firmly closed the heavy wooden doors behind me, sealing us inside the quiet room. It was time to permanently sever my son from his last remaining financial lifeline. I did not need to introduce myself or explain my presence to the man sitting behind the desk. I have conducted highly lucrative commercial real estate business with this specific financial institution for over 40 years. I have personally golfed with the entire board of directors every single summer for the past 2 decades. I have deposited millions of dollars of legitimate construction profits into their vaults without ever missing a single payment on any of my corporate development loans. My reputation in the Chicago financial district is absolutely spotless and heavily insulated by decades of relentless hard work. The executive sitting in front of me knew exactly who I was and the immense value of my holding company portfolios. My spoken word carries a permanent, unbreakable weight in these towering glass buildings. That is a level of elite institutional trust that DeAndre could never possibly replicate with his fabricated credit scores and his stolen assets. My son believed he could trick a massive financial institution using forged medical paperwork. He failed to realize that the men who control these massive vaults trust personal history far more than they will ever trust a freshly printed piece of paper. I walked directly to the edge of the large mahogany desk and opened my canvas jacket. I retrieved the thick legal binder prepared by my attorney Bradley and placed it squarely in front of the chief loan officer. I did not raise my voice or display any emotional distress. I simply instructed the executive to review the certified documents detailing the exact nature of my son's catastrophic deception. The executive opened the binder and quickly scanned the certified affidavit from the state medical board proving the country club plastic surgeon was a disgraced criminal. He read the official court transcript from Judge Harrison explicitly dismissing the emergency conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice. Finally, I handed him the active premium real estate listing and the digital escrow contract for my residential home. I plainly explained that DeAndre and Heather were currently using a demonstrably forged medical proxy to illegally liquidate the exact same physical property they had used as collateral to secure their massive $2 million commercial loan. I provided undeniable legal proof that the underlying asset securing the bank's massive financial risk was actively involved in an impending fraudulent real estate transaction. The executive stared at the certified court documents with wide, horrified eyes. He realized the bank was currently holding a completely worthless guarantee secured by a man actively under investigation for multiple counts of felony perjury and grand theft. The chief loan officer did not hesitate for a single second. Corporate banking institutions possess absolutely zero loyalty to individuals who expose them to massive federal liability. He immediately picked up his desk phone and bypassed his standard lending team connecting directly to the Central Risk Management Department. He ordered an aggressive and immediate financial lockdown on every single account associated with my son and my daughter-in-law. He did not wait for the 24-hour extension DeAndre had begged for earlier that afternoon. The executive authorized the bank to aggressively offset their extreme financial risk by instantly seizing any available capital. The risk management team executed the command flawlessly. They permanently froze every single one of Heather's corporate business accounts, completely cutting off her failing luxury art gallery from the outside world. They then moved directly into DeAndre's personal checking and savings accounts, aggressively draining every last remaining dollar to partially satisfy the massive defaulted commercial loan. The executive hung up the phone and assured me that my personal estate was completely secure from their corporate grasp. I thanked him for his swift professional action and walked out of the towering glass building. DeAndre and Heather were currently sitting in my house celebrating their impending real estate closing. They were completely unaware that the bank had just legally wiped them out. They were now left with exactly zero liquid cash to their names. DeAndre sat in a dim upscale steakhouse downtown, completely oblivious to the financial execution that had just occurred. He finished his expensive, imported steak and signaled the waiter for the check, projecting the image of a wealthy real estate victor who had just secured his future. He handed over his heavy metal credit card with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist. The waiter returned 2 minutes later with a tight, uncomfortable expression, informing my son that the transaction had been forcefully declined. DeAndre scoffed at the perceived incompetence, snatching the card back and immediately opening his private banking application on his smartphone to transfer the funds manually. The digital screen loaded, displaying a blinding red negative balance across his primary checking account, his savings account, and his emergency business lines. The numbers plunged deep into the abyss. The bank had not just frozen his assets. The risk management team had aggressively drained every single available dollar to offset the massive commercial loan default I had just exposed. DeAndre stared at the screen as the blood completely drained from his face. The crushing reality of his situation violently collapsed the walls of his manufactured elite reality. His father had not retreated to a corner to quietly surrender. I had surgically severed their absolute last financial lifeline and left them suffocating in the open air. He tossed a meager handful of crumpled cash onto the table to cover the tip and sprinted out the doors in pure panic. Stripped entirely of their immediate funds and facing an inescapable federal deadline, DeAndre and Heather realized they lacked the capital to even hire a criminal defense attorney. They aggressively tracked my digital footprint back to the luxury hotel suite where I had established my temporary headquarters. The heavy wooden door of my room rattled under a series of frantic, violent knocks. I walked over and looked through the brass peephole. The arrogant posture they had wielded like a weapon just 24 hours ago was completely gone. DeAndre was sweating profusely, his expensive tie torn open at the collar. Heather stood beside him with her designer makeup severely smudged from heavy, unchecked weeping. They had abandoned their predatory superiority and descended into raw, animalistic desperation. They pounded their fists against the wood, their voices cracking as they loudly begged for a chance to explain their actions. They pleaded for a 5-minute conversation, promising they could make everything right if I just opened the door and listened to their apologies. They were banking on the lingering remnants of my paternal instinct to rescue them from the catastrophic consequences of their own malicious greed. I unlatched the deadbolt and slowly swung the heavy door open. I stood firmly in the threshold, filling the frame with my broad shoulders. I did not step aside to invite them into the sanctuary of my suite. I looked down at the two thieves standing in the hallway with absolute uncompromising coldness. Heather immediately launched into a hysterical, tearful plea for mercy. I silenced her instantly by raising my right hand. I looked directly into her panicked eyes and revealed the truth I had kept hidden for over 36 months. I explicitly informed my daughter-in-law that I had known her high society art gallery was financially bleeding out for 3 consecutive years. I received quarterly municipal audit reports for every commercial property within my holding portfolio. I saw the massive revenue drops and the desperate vendor cancellations long before she ever forged my medical proxy. I explained that I deliberately allowed her to struggle in silence. I needed to see if she possessed a genuine work ethic or the humility to ask for honest guidance from an experienced business owner. She comprehensively failed my silent test. Instead of rolling up her sleeves and restructuring her failing business model, she chose to steal from the very man who physically poured the concrete foundation beneath her feet. She chose the path of a coward. Heather frantically attempted to pivot her defensive strategy by weaponizing family guilt. She sobbed heavily and claimed their desperate actions were born out of a genuine desire to protect the sprawling family legacy from my supposedly declining aging mind. She insisted they only took control because they feared I would squander the hard-earned estate. I systematically destroyed her pathetic argument by reciting the exact forensic details of their massive embezzlement. I did not raise my voice, but my words struck them like physical blows. I stated the precise date in November when they illegally wired $60,000 from my secondary trust to purchase her imported sports car. I recited the exact dollar amount of the fraudulent commercial loan they secured in February to cover her unpaid inventory invoices. I listed the timeline of the forged signatures they used to liquidate my private stocks just to maintain their elite country club memberships. I presented a flawless, undeniable verbal ledger of their absolute moral decay, stripping away every last excuse they tried to hide behind. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were not well-meaning guardians attempting to preserve a legacy for future generations. They were nothing more than common thieves attempting to drain my lifeblood to fund an artificial reality they lacked the discipline and the intelligence to build themselves. Heather covered her face with her hands, entirely defeated by the brutal objective facts of her own documented crimes. DeAndre watched his wife completely collapse under the crushing weight of the truth. He realized that manipulation and emotional blackmail would no longer grant him access to my resources. The absolute reality of his impending federal wire fraud indictment and his total financial ruin finally snapped his legs. My son dropped heavily to his knees right there on the patterned carpet of the hotel hallway. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, completely stripping away his pride. He clasped his hands together and begged me to call the commercial bank executives. He pleaded with me to use my influence to halt the aggressive asset seizures before they completely repossessed their luxury vehicles and froze them out of their suburban lifestyle forever. He cried that they needed their cars to at least maintain the appearance of stability while they tried to navigate the legal nightmare. I looked down at the boy I had raised, feeling the heavy, tragic burden of what he had chosen to become. I did not reach down to help him stand up. I looked him dead in the eyes and informed him that the bank does not delay its protective measures for convicted perjurers. I calmly told my son that his desperate request was entirely too late. The massive flatbed tow trucks were already dispatched to his address over an hour ago. He was officially out of time, out of money, and completely out of options. The morning of the real estate closing arrived with a cold and deceptive calm. DeAndre and Heather sat side by side inside the sterile glass-enclosed conference room of a premium downtown title agency. They projected the manufactured confidence of wealthy suburbanites finalizing a routine portfolio adjustment. Across the polished mahogany table sat the aggressive overseas cash buyer and his dedicated local real estate agent. The title officer positioned herself at the head of the table, organizing a massive stack of complex transfer documents and final disclosure agreements. A heavy digital monitor mounted on the wall displayed the pending international wire transfer. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were actively queued up and ready to be deposited directly into my son's frantically waiting accounts. DeAndre firmly believed he had successfully outrun the catastrophic commercial loan recall and the impending federal fraud investigation. He believed his ruthless fire sale of my personal legacy was seconds away from saving him from total financial annihilation. He completely ignored the crushing fact that his wife's business accounts were permanently frozen, and his own personal checking balances were aggressively drained to zero by the risk management team. He focused his entire attention on the heavy brass pen resting between his trembling fingers. He reached out and picked up the pen, preparing to sign his name on the final transfer deed. He was entirely ready to legally liquidate the exact property I had spent 40 years building just to cover the debts of his own malicious greed. He leaned forward to press the black ink against the crisp white paper. Before the brass tip of the pen could touch the legal document, the heavy wooden doors of the conference room swung open with a violent, resounding crash. The sudden noise completely shattered the quiet, professional atmosphere of the title agency. I stepped through the threshold and walked directly into the room. I did not wear my canvas work jacket or my heavy construction boots today. I wore a tailored dark suit that commanded absolute respect and undeniable authority in any corporate setting. I did not come alone to this final dramatic confrontation. My corporate attorney, Bradley, flanked my right side, carrying his heavy leather briefcase and projecting a cold, predatory focus. Flanking my left side was a towering uniformed investigator dispatched directly from the State Attorney General office. The investigator wore a tactical vest and a severe expression that instantly drained the manufactured confidence right out of the room. DeAndre dropped the brass pen onto the mahogany table. It clattered loudly against the wood as the blood completely vanished from his face. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing his invisible escape hatch had just been brutally slammed shut. Heather gasped loudly and physically recoiled deep into her leather chair. The overseas cash buyer and his real estate agent looked up in absolute shock at the sudden hostile intrusion. They immediately recognized the unmistakable and intimidating presence of state law enforcement. The sterile conference room was no longer a place of lucrative business. It had just been transformed into an active and highly volatile crime scene. I stopped at the edge of the conference table and stared down at the final transfer deed resting just inches away from my son. Looking at that piece of paper brought a profound and incredibly heavy memory rushing to the forefront of my mind. I vividly remembered the exact afternoon I finished laying the heavy slate roof on that house. My hands were bleeding and my shoulders ached immensely from months of brutal manual labor. Corinne walked out onto the fresh green lawn carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. I climbed down the wooden ladder and stood beside her, looking up at the magnificent structure we had brought into existence through sheer determination. I made a solemn, unwavering vow to my wife on that very day. I promised her that the home I built for us would remain a safe fortress for our family forever. I swore that no outside force or financial disaster would ever take our sanctuary away. I intend to keep that sacred vow today, regardless of the extreme cost. I will not allow the foundation of our shared legacy to be liquidated and sold to a stranger just to fund the corrupt and cowardly mistakes of a son who entirely forgot where he came from. DeAndre abruptly pushed his leather chair back and jumped to his feet. He desperately attempted to regain control of the shattered room. He pointed a shaking finger at me and began shouting loudly for the building security team to intervene. He aggressively demanded that the title agent call the police and remove his mentally incompetent father from the premises immediately. He shrieked that I was suffering from a severe psychotic episode and deliberately attempting to sabotage a perfectly legal commercial transaction. He threw a frantic, pathetic tantrum, trying to drown out the undeniable reality of his situation with sheer volume and fabricated outrage. Bradley completely ignored my son's hysterical screaming. My attorney stepped forward with surgical precision and placed his hand flat over the final transfer contract. He looked directly at the bewildered title agent and spoke with a calm, devastating authority that silenced the room. Bradley formally instructed the agent to completely halt the execution of the international wire transfer. He firmly advised her to rigorously review the master holding company ownership records before she authorized a single signature on that deed. He warned her that proceeding with the current transaction would make her title agency an active and liable participant in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. The uniformed state investigator crossed his arms over his chest and nodded in silent, absolute agreement. The threat of immediate criminal liability silenced the room. DeAndre stopped screaming and stared at my attorney with a look of pure, unadulterated panic. The title agent looked incredibly confused by the sudden escalation and the severe legal warnings. She nervously adjusted her glasses and stated that she had already verified the provided documentation during the preliminary escrow phase. DeAndre frantically grabbed a thick folder from his side of the table. He aggressively presented the forged medical power of attorney to the state investigator and the bewildered title agent. He loudly proclaimed that the certified document granted him absolute and unquestionable legal authority to sign real estate transfers on behalf of his declining father. He swore that the medical proxy completely superseded any personal objections I might have regarding the sale of the home. He was clinging desperately to the fabricated medical evaluation, completely unaware that Judge Harrison had already dismissed his petition with extreme prejudice and referred him for felony perjury just yesterday. He waved the fraudulent paper in the air, truly believing it was his impenetrable shield against the brutal consequences of his theft. Bradley simply shook his head with an expression of profound professional disgust. He did not bother arguing with my son or pointing out the revoked medical license of the disgraced plastic surgeon. Bradley calmly reached into his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick master document bound by a dark blue cover and embossed with a certified state seal. He placed the heavy packet directly on top of the forged medical proxy. He was about to permanently destroy the illusion that DeAndre ever possessed the power to sell my legacy. Bradley rested his large hands flat against the polished mahogany table and leaned forward. He did not raise his voice to match DeAndre's hysterical screaming. He spoke with the quiet, lethal precision of an apex predator closing its jaws around a trapped animal. Bradley tapped his index finger twice against the dark blue cover of the master document he had just produced. He announced to the entirely silent room that the forged medical power of attorney sitting underneath it was completely useless. He explained that DeAndre was aggressively trying to execute a commercial real estate transaction using personal legal authority over an individual citizen. Bradley opened the thick folder and slid the certified master deed directly toward the bewildered title agent. He plainly stated that I did not actually own the residential property as a private individual, and I had not owned it for over a decade. The sprawling estate and the land it rested upon belonged entirely to a heavily fortified, irrevocable blind trust. I sat silently in my tailored suit and watched my son stare at the blue folder as if it were an active explosive device. DeAndre's chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He had spent weeks fabricating a complex web of medical lies to steal my personal identity. He had never once bothered to hire a competent financial investigator to verify the actual corporate ownership of his childhood home. Bradley systematically dismantled the remaining fragments of my son's arrogant delusion. He looked directly at the overseas cash buyer and the local real estate agent. My attorney expertly outlined the rigid, impenetrable parameters governing the irrevocable trust. He explained that a standard medical proxy granted a designated guardian the authority to manage personal health care decisions and basic individual checking accounts. It absolutely did not grant anyone the legal jurisdiction to liquidate heavily protected corporate assets or dissolve a blind trust. The legal wall I had built was entirely insurmountable. Even if DeAndre possessed a legitimate medical evaluation from a board-certified neurologist, his paperwork would still be completely worthless in this specific room. Bradley picked up the fraudulent medical proxy signed by the disgraced country club plastic surgeon and casually tossed it back across the table toward my son. The paper slid across the polished wood and bumped into DeAndre's clenched fists. Bradley informed the entire room that a personal power of attorney trying to sell a corporate trust asset was the legal equivalent of a stranger trying to sell a public monument. DeAndre had brought a fake key to a vault that did not even possess a keyhole. The meticulously crafted illusion of his absolute control evaporated into thin air, leaving him completely exposed and legally defenseless in front of a uniformed state investigator. I maintained an impassive expression while I watched the absolute terror wash over my son's face. Establishing this specific trust structure was the very first major financial decision I made exactly 1 week after burying Corinne. The grief of losing my wife was incredibly raw and suffocating, but my protective instincts were sharper than ever. During the days leading up to her funeral, I watched DeAndre closely. I saw the way he eagerly inventoried our assets and whispered with Heather about the future value of our estate, while the soil on his mother's grave was still fresh. Corinne always believed our son would eventually outgrow his selfish ambition, but I saw the dark rot actively spreading in his character. I refused to let the empire we built with our blood and sweat become a slush fund for imported sports cars and failing vanity projects. I quietly hired Bradley to construct a legal fortress so dense and complicated that a greedy amateur could never possibly breach its walls. I planned for this exact betrayal 10 years in advance. The title agent reached out with trembling hands and pulled the certified master deed closer to her. She quickly scanned the dense legal paragraphs and the verified municipal seals stamped across the bottom of the pages. Her face lost all remaining color. She audibly gasped and aggressively pushed her heavy leather chair away from the conference table as if the mahogany wood had suddenly caught fire. She was a licensed professional who had just been moments away from authorizing a massive fraudulent international wire transfer. The stark realization of her own near-catastrophic legal liability hit her like a physical blow. She looked up at DeAndre with an expression of pure, unfiltered professional horror. She loudly declared that he was actively attempting to finalize a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction for a property he had absolutely zero legal or equitable claim to. She grabbed her official notary stamp and her closing ledger and physically backed away from my son. She stammered a frantic apology to the state investigator standing by the door, desperately trying to distance her agency from the unfolding felony. The title agent firmly announced that the closing was permanently terminated and that her office would be immediately freezing all connected escrow accounts pending a full federal review. DeAndre's invisible escape hatch was officially bricked over. The overseas cash buyer erupted from his chair with a terrifying volcanic fury. He was a ruthless international investor who did not tolerate being utilized as a pawn in a sloppy domestic fraud scheme. He slammed his fists down on the conference table so hard the heavy brass pens rattled against the wood. He turned his vicious rage directly toward DeAndre and Heather. He screamed that they had completely wasted his highly valuable time and intentionally dragged his reputable development firm into an active criminal conspiracy. He aggressively pointed his finger in DeAndre's face and demanded the immediate and unconditional return of his massive six-figure escrow deposit. He did not wait for my son to stammer out a pathetic excuse or offer a meaningless apology. The buyer grabbed his sleek leather briefcase and stormed out of the conference room with his terrified real estate agent sprinting right behind him. Before he crossed the threshold, the investor turned back and promised to unleash a legion of corporate litigators to sue DeAndre for every single dollar he had left to his name. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut, leaving my son and his wife trapped inside the quiet room with my attorney and the uniformed state investigator. The walls were closing in rapidly, and there was nowhere left to run. The frantic real estate agent scrambled out the door directly behind her wealthy overseas client. The title agent quickly gathered her notary stamps and her heavy legal ledgers. She practically sprinted out of the conference room to immediately consult her corporate legal counsel regarding her dangerous exposure to the aborted transaction. The heavy wooden doors clicked firmly shut. The sterile closing room cleared out entirely, leaving only my family, my attorney, and the state investigator standing in the tense silence. DeAndre stared blankly at the empty leather chair where his massive cash salvation had been sitting just moments before. His entire world completely collapsed around him. The absolute reality of his impending federal prosecution and his total financial annihilation crashed down onto his shoulders. He possessed absolutely no liquid cash, no viable assets, and zero legal avenues of escape. Instead of accepting the brutal consequences of his own malicious actions, my son desperately searched the room for a scapegoat. He turned his head slowly and locked his eyes directly onto his wife. His hands balled into tight, shaking fists at his sides. His voice trembled with a terrifying, uncontrolled rage as he prepared to tear down the criminal alliance that had fueled their entire conspiracy. DeAndre pointed a rigid finger directly at Heather and unleashed a vicious, screaming tirade. He loudly declared that her completely failing luxury art gallery was the sole reason he was currently facing a devastating federal prison sentence. He aggressively blamed her endless obsession with elite high society status and her relentless demands for imported designer clothes for totally draining his legitimate corporate income. He shrieked that she constantly manipulated him into forging the medical documents and taking out the massive illegal commercial loans just to keep her pathetic vanity project artificially afloat. He painted himself as a desperate, trapped husband who was maliciously coerced by a greedy, out-of-touch wife. He aggressively refused to accept even a single ounce of personal blame for the forged signatures, the stolen money, or the horrific legal attacks against his own father. He screamed that Heather had completely ruined his impeccable professional reputation and permanently destroyed his entire life. The echo of his loud, desperate accusations bounced harshly against the glass walls of the conference room. He was a cornered animal attempting to chew off his own leg to escape the steel trap. I stood quietly next to Bradley and the uniformed state investigator, observing the horrific spectacle unfolding in front of me. I watched my son and my daughter-in-law completely cannibalize each other in a frantic, pathetic attempt to save their own skins. A profound and heavy grief settled into my chest. I looked at DeAndre and realized the devastating, undeniable truth. The boy I raised with discipline, and the young man I taught to take absolute accountability on the brutal construction sites, was entirely dead and gone. In his place stood a weak, pathetic coward who absolutely refused to accept the consequences of his own documented actions. The painful realization confirmed that the relentless protective armor I built around my estate was completely necessary. I could not allow the magnificent legacy Corinne and I forged through decades of sweat to be liquidated to fund the survival of a coward. Heather did not absorb the violent verbal abuse quietly or shrink away from his accusations. Her face flushed with a shade of pure, unchecked rage. She aggressively stepped forward, closing the physical distance between them. She retaliated with a devastating and completely unexpected secret that instantly paralyzed the entire room. She screamed at the top of her lungs that her art gallery was absolutely not the primary drain on their joint bank accounts. She revealed that she had secretly hired a private investigator of her own 4 months ago, when she noticed massive, unexplained cash withdrawals. She loudly announced to everyone present that DeAndre had been secretly leasing a luxury high-rise apartment in a neighboring state. She exposed his hidden mistress and the exorbitant amounts of stolen money he systematically funneled across state lines to fund his illicit double life. She brutally dismantled his pathetic victim narrative, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that his own selfish secret betrayals drained their finances far faster than her business ever could. DeAndre lost all the color in his face as his darkest secret was violently dragged into the light. The toxic criminal alliance between husband and wife shattered into absolute dust right in front of my eyes. They stood mere inches apart, screaming vicious, unrelenting insults at each other. They were so entirely consumed by their mutual hatred and their exposed secrets that they completely forgot about the legal authorities standing right next to them. The towering uniformed state investigator finally stepped forward. He effectively interrupted the chaotic screaming match with a booming, authoritative voice that demanded absolute silence. He did not care about their marital disputes, their failing businesses, or their hidden luxury apartments. He looked directly at DeAndre and Heather with an expression of cold, professional duty. He informed them that attempting to execute a fraudulent multi-million-dollar real estate transaction utilizing a forged medical proxy officially constitutes felony wire fraud and severe grand theft. He plainly stated that the digital and physical evidence had already been fully secured by my attorney. He delivered the final crushing blow, telling them to stop arguing about who was to blame. He announced they were both officially the primary targets of an active joint federal investigation and explicitly warned them they were not permitted to leave the state jurisdiction. The towering state investigator stood blocking the main exit of the conference room. He did not immediately reach for a pair of steel handcuffs. He simply delivered the devastating federal mandate and stepped aside to let the reality sink in. DeAndre and Heather did not linger a single second to argue their case or consult with expensive legal counsel. The terrifying reality of an active federal wire fraud investigation finally shattered their arrogant suburban facade. They scrambled past the investigator and practically sprinted down the polished hallway of the title agency. They desperately needed to escape the immediate proximity of law enforcement before a formal arrest warrant could be officially processed and executed. They pushed through the heavy glass lobby doors and rushed frantically toward the adjacent parking garage. Their previous bitter screaming match was entirely paused by the mutual, overwhelming instinct for sheer self-preservation. They were no longer a married couple negotiating a lucrative commercial real estate deal. They were two cornered fugitives running entirely out of time. They climbed into Heather's white luxury SUV with violently trembling hands. DeAndre aggressively threw the heavy vehicle into reverse and sped out of the concrete structure. Their immediate plan was painfully obvious. They intended to speed directly back to my property to secure whatever liquid cash, jewelry, and designer valuables they could physically carry before the authorities froze their physical assets. They were attempting to salvage the remaining scraps of their lavish lifestyle to fund a desperate legal escape. The heavy luxury SUV tore down the interstate at highly illegal speeds. The interior of the vehicle was filled with a thick, suffocating silence. Neither DeAndre nor Heather spoke a single word to each other during the frantic 30-minute drive back to the affluent suburbs. The absolute weight of their impending federal indictments hovered over them like a dark, heavy storm cloud. DeAndre gripped the leather steering wheel with tight white knuckles, weaving aggressively through the afternoon traffic. He firmly believed that if he could just get inside the house, he could pack enough high-value items to hire a sleazy defense attorney and delay the inevitable prosecution. He swung the heavy vehicle recklessly around the final corner leading onto my quiet tree-lined street. He stomped aggressively on the brakes the exact moment my residential property came into view. The heavy tires screeched loudly against the black asphalt. DeAndre and Heather stared through the windshield in absolute unadulterated horror. The wide cobblestone driveway leading up to the house was completely barricaded from the street. Two massive industrial flatbed tow trucks were parked at harsh diagonal angles directly across the property line. The heavy diesel engines idled loudly, filling the quiet neighborhood with a deep, terrifying mechanical rumble. Heavy steel chains and thick yellow recovery straps were actively being unspooled by three burly men wearing grease-stained coveralls. The bank had not waited a single minute to begin the aggressive asset reclamation process. I sat quietly inside the cab of my vintage truck parked completely out of sight just down the street. I watched the entire chaotic scene unfold through the windshield with a deep, heavy ache radiating in my chest. Seeing those massive tow trucks moving in on my son forced a vivid memory to the surface of my mind. I clearly remembered the exact Saturday I bought DeAndre his very first bicycle. It was a bright red 10-speed frame. I spent hours in the driveway teaching him how to properly grease the chain and carefully adjust the brake pads. I specifically tried to instill the profound value of rigorous daily maintenance and taking absolute pride in the things you own. I wanted him to understand that true lasting value requires consistent, relentless work. My son entirely discarded that valuable lesson the exact moment he gained access to easy corporate credit. He traded the quiet dignity of hard labor for the hollow instant gratification of imported leather and vanity branding. He treated his expensive vehicles exactly how he treated his own family. He completely neglected the foundation and simply expected someone else to clean up the wreckage. DeAndre threw the driver's side door open and sprinted frantically toward the barricaded driveway. He watched in absolute utter disbelief as thick steel cables were tightly wrapped around the custom axles of his imported black sports car. The heavy hydraulic winch groaned loudly as it hoisted the vehicle off the pavement and dragged it violently onto the tilted steel flatbed. The second tow truck operator was already actively maneuvering his massive rig to block Heather's white SUV from escaping the street. DeAndre completely lost his temper. He aggressively charged at the lead operator, waving his arms and screaming at the top of his lungs. He loudly demanded that the men unhook his expensive vehicle, immediately threatening to call the police and report a grand theft auto. The burly repo agent did not flinch or back away from my son's hysterical screaming. The man had dealt with screaming angry debtors for 20 long years. He calmly reached into the chest pocket of his grease-stained coveralls and pulled out a sharply folded legal document. He shoved the paper directly into DeAndre's chest. It was a certified court-ordered asset seizure notice dispatched immediately by the commercial lending bank. The legal mandate explicitly authorized the aggressive repossession of all high-value vehicles to offset the catastrophic $2 million commercial loan default. The piece of paper legally stripped my son of his most prized superficial possession right there in the middle of the street. Heather completely ignored the humiliating public repossession of their expensive vehicles. She clearly recognized that the cars were already permanently lost to the commercial bank, but she knew her highly valuable collection of designer handbags and imported jewelry remained locked safely inside the house. She desperately needed those liquid assets to fund a massive criminal legal defense. She sprinted right past the massive diesel trucks and ran frantically up the cobblestone path toward the front porch. She aggressively jammed her brass key into the heavy oak front door and twisted it with all her might. The internal cylinder completely refused to turn. She frantically rattled the heavy brass handle, screaming in pure frustration as she realized the lock had been entirely replaced. Before she could grab a heavy decorative stone from the garden to shatter the front living room window, the thick wooden door suddenly swung open from the inside. A towering, broad-shouldered man wearing a black tactical uniform and a communication earpiece stepped out onto the porch. He was the lead agent of the private security firm I had legally contracted just an hour prior. He crossed his massive arms over his chest and stared down at my panicked daughter-in-law. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask how he could possibly help her. He firmly informed Heather that the holding company had officially repossessed the entire estate. He bluntly stated that she was currently trespassing on strictly private property and had exactly 10 seconds to vacate the premises before he physically detained her. Heather stumbled backward away from the towering private security contractor and nearly tripped over the uneven cobblestones of the brick walkway. She watched in absolute horror as the heavy flatbed tow trucks secured their luxury vehicles and rumbled away down the suburban street. They were completely locked out of the estate and entirely stripped of their primary transportation. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, cold shadows across the manicured lawn. DeAndre slowly walked over to the concrete curb and sat down heavily. The reality of his impending federal wire fraud indictment and his total financial annihilation completely crushed his spirit. He had absolutely zero liquid cash to rent a hotel room and no vehicle to drive to a shelter. The freezing evening air began to bite through his thin designer suit jacket. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket with visibly trembling hands. He dialed my number. I answered the call from the quiet interior of my vintage truck, parked just 1 block away in the gathering dark. My son did not yell or issue empty legal threats. His voice was completely broken and entirely hollow. He wept softly into the receiver. He begged me to help them find a safe place to sleep for the night. The arrogant corporate executive who attempted to steal my entire legacy was now reduced to a terrified fugitive sitting on the side of a dark road with absolutely nothing left to his name. I instructed my son to walk to a specific 24-hour diner located on the grim industrial edge of town. It took them over an hour to navigate the confusing public transit system and walk the remaining miles in their expensive designer shoes. I sat at a corner booth under the harsh, buzzing glare of the fluorescent ceiling lights. I drank a simple cup of black coffee and waited patiently. DeAndre and Heather finally pushed through the grease-stained glass doors. They looked completely exhausted and thoroughly ruined. The crisp, tailored suits and pristine makeup they wore to the title agency just hours ago were heavily stained with sweat and street dirt. They slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me without saying a single word. They stared at the sticky laminate tabletop, unable to make direct eye contact with the man they had tried to destroy. I did not offer them food or false comfort. I reached inside my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. I placed the heavy legal packets directly onto the center of the table and slid them across the sticky surface toward my son and his wife. The stark reality of their final reckoning rested inside those envelopes. They knew they had nowhere else to run and no one else to call for a sudden miraculous rescue. I watched my son stare at the manila envelopes with a look of pure, terrified anticipation. A lesser man might have left them sitting on that cold concrete curb to completely fend for themselves in the dark. I could have easily allowed them to freeze on the streets of Chicago as appropriate payment for their ultimate betrayal. But true enduring justice requires highly calculated consequences rather than simple blind cruelty. I needed to ensure their punishment was incredibly harsh but not entirely lethal. I would never allow my only biological son to die in a forgotten alleyway. However, I would absolutely never allow him or his wife to step foot near my commercial empire or my private estate ever again. The financial umbilical cord was permanently and violently severed. I needed to establish an impenetrable physical and legal boundary to fiercely protect the legacy Corinne and I built together. Giving them a microscopic lifeline was not an act of unconditional forgiveness or parental weakness. It was a cold, strategic maneuver designed to permanently neutralize them as a future threat and remind them of their colossal failure every single day of their lives. They needed to survive long enough to face the severe federal charges they had brought upon themselves. I looked directly into DeAndre's bloodshot eyes and outlined my absolute final terms. I informed them that the envelopes contained comprehensive legally binding confessions meticulously prepared by my corporate attorney. The documents detailed their exact roles in forging the medical power of attorney and aggressively securing the unauthorized commercial loans. The paperwork explicitly outlined their attempt to illegally liquidate my private residential property through a fraudulent international wire transfer. I told them they must sign every single page and formally admit to their catastrophic crimes on the permanent legal record. If they refused, I would immediately hand the unredacted security footage of Heather stealing Corinne's jewelry directly to the investigating detectives to expedite her grand theft arrest. If they complied and signed the confessions, I offered a single, non-negotiable lifeline. I would personally prepay a basic 6-month lease for a small 1-bedroom apartment in a rough working-class neighborhood. I would not provide them with a single dollar of liquid cash or any transportation assistance whatsoever. The apartment would simply give them a temporary roof over their heads while they faced their impending federal indictments and catastrophic bankruptcy proceedings. They had exactly 2 minutes to decide their fate, or I would walk out the door and leave them to the winter cold. DeAndre and Heather stared at the harsh, unforgiving terms resting on the diner table. They were completely beaten and entirely out of options. They possessed no leverage and no powerful high society allies left to call for an emergency bailout. DeAndre picked up a cheap plastic pen from the table with a violently shaking hand. He opened the manila envelope and began signing his name to the comprehensive legal confessions. Heather openly wept as she signed her own admission of grand theft and felony commercial fraud. They surrendered their entire fabricated reality with every single stroke of the pen. The moment the final signature was executed, a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped out from the adjacent booth, hidden in the shadows of the diner. Bradley walked over to our table wearing his immaculate tailored suit. He gathered the signed confessions and securely locked them inside his heavy leather briefcase. My son gasped in profound shock, realizing my attorney had been sitting right next to us recording the entire transaction as a verified legal witness. Bradley looked down at them with pure professional disdain before walking out the front doors into the night. I now possessed an impenetrable shield of documented confessions. I was absolutely and permanently protected from any future legal attacks they might ever attempt. The final checkmate was officially complete. The cold winter weeks slowly turned into a bitter damp spring across the city of Chicago. The massive, heavy gears of the criminal justice system do not move quickly, but they grind forward with absolutely zero mercy. The district attorney did not offer my son the quiet, discreet dismissal he desperately prayed for. The ambitious state prosecutor aggressively pressed forward with multiple counts of felony perjury and severe commercial wire fraud. They utilized the completely disastrous courtroom debacle and the unredacted digital audio recordings as the absolute foundation of their ironclad case. The comprehensive legal confessions DeAndre and Heather signed under duress inside that greasy diner served as the final undeniable nails in their respective coffins. Bradley maintained constant, ruthless communication with the prosecuting team, ensuring that my heavily documented victim status shielded me entirely from the grueling courtroom cross-examinations. I did not have to step foot inside a municipal building or face a single aggressive defense attorney. I simply sat inside the quiet sanctuary of my newly restored home and watched the local news networks report on the spectacular downfall of a supposedly elite suburban couple. The media ruthlessly exposed their fraudulent real estate scheme and their disastrous commercial loan default to the entire city. The pristine high society reputation they had destroyed my life to maintain was completely pulverized on the front page of the Financial Gazette. DeAndre quickly realized that his polished charisma and his expensive designer suits held absolutely zero currency when facing the crushing, unrelenting weight of the federal government. Facing insurmountable corporate debt and terrifying federal legal liability, the toxic criminal alliance between my son and his wife violently collapsed. Heather did not stand by her husband during his darkest hour. She immediately hired a ruthless, cutthroat family lawyer and filed for a highly hostile, expedited divorce. She aggressively attempted to completely distance herself from DeAndre and his looming criminal convictions. She publicly claimed she was a helpless, terrified victim of his financial manipulation, hoping to secure a lenient plea arrangement for her own documented grand theft charges. The brutal divorce proceedings forced the complete and total liquidation of their few remaining shared assets. The bank formally foreclosed on their heavily mortgaged suburban estate. Heather was officially stripped of her failing luxury art gallery, her imported white SUV, and her coveted country club membership. She was abruptly forced to pack her designer wardrobe into cheap cardboard boxes and move directly back into the damp, unfinished basement of her elderly parents' home. Her wealthy, affluent friends immediately completely abandoned her the exact second her financial fraud became public knowledge. She became a total social pariah in the exact elite circles she had sacrificed her own morality to impress. She traded a life of fabricated luxury for a grim reality of relentless debt collection calls and looming probation hearings. The absolute humiliation of her spectacular public fall from grace was a far more devastating punishment than any concrete prison cell could ever be. DeAndre barely managed to avoid a lengthy federal prison sentence by accepting an incredibly harsh and uncompromising plea deal negotiated by a court-appointed public defender. The presiding judge showed absolutely no leniency to a man who attempted to financially exploit his own elderly father. My son was hit with a massive, staggering order of financial restitution to satisfy the commercial bank and the defrauded real estate agencies. He was officially stripped of his white-collar executive credentials and permanently banned from holding any fiduciary corporate positions. To meet his aggressive monthly court-ordered payments, DeAndre was forced to secure immediate employment in the only industry that would hire a convicted felon. He took a grueling, back-breaking physical labor job in commercial construction. The brutal irony of his new reality was undeniable. He was forced to enter the exact same unforgiving trade I had mastered decades ago. He was not managing the sites or designing the blueprints. He was starting at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy, carrying heavy bags of concrete and moving wet dirt in the freezing rain. 6 months after the final court gavel fell, I drove my vintage truck to the local post office to check my secured private mailbox. I retrieved a small stack of mundane corporate holding reports and utility bills. Resting at the very bottom of the metal box was a simple white envelope bearing a handwritten return address I did not immediately recognize. The handwriting was messy and completely lacking the rigid, polished calligraphy my son used to pride himself on. I carried the envelope back to the quiet cab of my truck and tore open the sealed flap. I pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. It was a letter from DeAndre. I braced myself for another round of pathetic emotional manipulation or a desperate, frantic plea for a secret financial bailout. I expected him to beg me to pay his massive court-ordered restitution. I read the first paragraph and realized my expectations were entirely wrong. The letter contained absolutely no arrogant demands and no pathetic, cowardly excuses. He did not blame Heather or the commercial bank or the harsh judge. My son offered a raw, genuine, and incredibly painful apology. He explicitly acknowledged the monstrous severity of his betrayal and the profound depth of his own greed. He wrote that his hands were currently covered in thick, painful blisters from hauling heavy lumber. He stated that the physical pain finally made him understand the massive, unspoken sacrifices I had made to build his childhood home. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck and read the handwritten letter a second time. The bustling noise of the busy city street outside my window faded into a heavy, absolute silence. A profound, suffocating sadness washed over my chest. The arrogant, entitled corporate executive I had battled in the courtroom was finally dead. The boy I had raised had been brutally stripped down to his bare foundation. Reading his sincere words of regret triggered a deep, powerful paternal instinct to reach out and pull him out of the dirt. I wanted to drive to his miserable apartment and tell him that he was finally forgiven. But I knew that offering him instant salvation would instantly destroy the painful progress he was currently making. True enduring character is forged exclusively in the fires of consequence. If I stepped in to rescue him now, I would simply be resetting the exact same destructive cycle of leniency that created this tragedy in the first place. The absolute most loving thing I could do for my son was to let him carry the heavy burden of his own actions. I carefully folded the piece of notebook paper and placed it securely inside the dark glove compartment of my truck. I did not draft a reply. I reached forward and firmly turned the metal ignition key. The heavy engine roared to life. I pulled out into the morning traffic, leaving the silence completely unbroken. I stood alone in the center of my expansive living room. The sheer volume of the silence inside the house was absolute and profound. For the first time in over 3 years, I did not feel the oppressive, heavy weight of constant manipulation pressing down on my shoulders. The suffocating tension that DeAndre and Heather had aggressively pumped into these walls was entirely gone. The house was physically empty, but the quiet atmosphere was no longer heavy or isolating. It was the distinct, hard-earned peace of a brutal battlefield that had finally been swept completely clear of toxic debris. The fraudulent medical proxies, the screaming matches, and the malicious real estate listings were nothing more than ash scattered to the freezing Chicago wind. I slowly walked across the custom hardwood floors I had installed decades ago, feeling the solid, unyielding foundation beneath my boots. I had successfully defended the fortress Corinne and I built from the very people who should have protected it. The emotional cost of severing my only biological son from my life was undeniably steep. Yet standing in the pristine calm of my reclaimed sanctuary, I knew with absolute certainty that the painful amputation was mathematically and morally necessary to save the host. I ran my calloused hand along the edge of the stone fireplace mantel, breathing in the crisp morning air circulating through the open windows. The war was officially over, and the territory was secure. A heavy diesel transport truck pulled into my long cobblestone driveway precisely at 9 in the morning. A team of professional bonded movers stepped out of the cab and began unloading a series of heavily secured wooden crates. When Heather had arrogantly attempted to throw Corinne's precious belongings into a municipal dumpster months ago, she fundamentally underestimated my proactive logistics. I had quietly intercepted the disposal team and paid them double their rate to safely divert every single item to a heavily fortified, climate-controlled private storage facility. Now I supervised the careful, meticulous return of my late wife's physical legacy. The movers gently unwrapped the thick protective padding from her beloved antique mahogany dining set. They placed the massive table exactly in the center of the formal dining room where it rightfully belonged. We spent the next 3 hours unpacking her vintage velvet reading chairs, her imported woven rugs, and the framed photographs capturing decades of our shared history. I directed the placement of every single piece with absolute precision, ensuring the aesthetic soul of the house was completely resurrected. Watching the empty, sterile spaces fill back up with the warm, familiar textures of Corinne's beautiful life brought a profound sense of physical relief to my chest. The arrogant, modern, minimalist home gym Heather had viciously planned to install was entirely erased from existence. My residential sanctuary was officially restored to its original architectural and emotional glory. I walked down the main corridor and entered my private study. I pulled the heavy canvas cover off my vintage mechanical drafting table and switched on the bright overhead architectural lamp. I retrieved a fresh roll of premium vellum paper and smoothed it flat across the angled wooden surface. I picked up my favorite weighted graphite pencil and began drawing the preliminary foundation lines for a massive new commercial project. I was not designing another lucrative corporate high-rise for downtown developers. I was actively drafting the comprehensive blueprints for a state-of-the-art youth community center located directly in the heart of my old working-class Chicago neighborhood. This ambitious project was a sacred dream Corinne and I had shared long before she passed away. We always planned to funnel our excess construction wealth back into the exact same neglected streets that forged our original relentless discipline. We wanted to build a safe, heavily funded sanctuary where young kids could learn highly profitable technical trades instead of repeating my son's catastrophic mistakes. I finally possessed the clear mental space to bring her ultimate vision into reality. I spent the entire afternoon meticulously adjusting the structural load ratios and designing an expansive vocational workshop wing for the community center. For the past 3 years, my vast financial resources and my mental energy were completely consumed by playing a silent, exhausting game of defensive chess against my own family. I was forced to hoard my capital to build legal fortresses and actively monitor fraudulent commercial loans. Now I finally possessed the absolute time, the total environmental peace, and the completely unburdened capital required to execute this massive philanthropic operation. I did not have to worry about Heather embezzling the project funds to buy designer handbags. I did not have to actively block DeAndre from secretly leveraging the community center property to cover his illegal offshore debts. I reviewed the final detailed architectural sketches spread across the drafting table. I felt a tremendous sense of profound positive purpose actively returning to my calloused hands. The vast commercial empire I had aggressively protected was no longer just a static vault of hoarded wealth. It was about to become a dynamic, functional tool designed to fundamentally alter the trajectory of hundreds of young lives. I was utilizing the exact same architectural brilliance that DeAndre had foolishly dismissed as senile decay to build a monument of genuine, lasting value. The dark, chaotic chapter of my life had officially closed, allowing a brilliant new era of constructive growth to firmly take root. The next morning, I woke up long before the dawn. I walked into my pristine kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. I poured the steaming liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and walked out through the glass doors onto my expansive back porch. The crisp morning air filled my lungs as I stood near the wooden railing. I watched the vibrant orange and purple colors of the sunrise slowly illuminate the sprawling acres of my protected property. I am 68 years old. My mind is absolutely razor sharp, and my heavily fortified commercial empire is permanently secure from any outside threat. I survived the ultimate unthinkable betrayal engineered by my own flesh and blood, and I emerged entirely unbroken. I successfully defended my dignity and my legacy without compromising my core principles. I raised my ceramic mug and took a slow, satisfying sip of the hot black coffee. DeAndre and Heather fundamentally misunderstood the actual definition of power. They believed that wealth was measured by the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway and the elite country club memberships they stole to impress strangers. I looked out over the quiet, peaceful land I owned outright. True, enduring wealth is not the massive balance sitting inside a frozen corporate bank account. True wealth is the absolute unrestricted freedom to drink a simple cup of coffee in the morning without ever having to ask a single human being for permission. 2 years have passed since the morning I stood in that diner and listened to my son try to erase my existence. Today I stand in the center of a massive open-air workshop located right in the heart of my old Chicago neighborhood. The Youth Community Center is no longer just a collection of architectural blueprints spread across my vintage drafting table. It is a living, breathing structure made of reinforced steel, thick concrete, and heavy masonry. The sharp smell of freshly cut lumber and hot welding sparks fills the cavernous room. Dozens of young men and women walk through these heavy double doors every single morning to learn the exact same rigorous commercial trades that saved my own life over 4 decades ago. They do not come here looking for easy handouts or shortcuts to a luxury lifestyle. They arrive at the crack of dawn wearing heavy work boots and calloused hands, ready to master the fundamental mechanics of electrical engineering, plumbing, and structural carpentry. Building this facility was the absolute best investment I have ever made. I poured a significant portion of my recovered holding company portfolios directly into this neighborhood to ensure these kids have a fighting chance at real independence. I did not just sign a massive corporate check and walk away to play golf. I am here on the concrete floor every single day, actively teaching them how to read complex schematics and frame load-bearing walls. I am physically passing down the legacy of hard, uncompromising labor that my late wife Corinne and I valued above absolutely everything else. I refuse to let their toxic ambition destroy the beautiful community that gave me the fundamental tools to succeed in this harsh, challenging world. When you spend your entire life accumulating wealth, it becomes incredibly easy to confuse financial success with moral character. That was the singular greatest mistake I made when raising my own child. I wanted to shield him from the brutal, exhausting struggles I endured when I was his age. I paid for his premium education, bought him his first reliable vehicle, and quietly smoothed out the rough edges of his early adulthood. I foolishly believed that removing adversity would allow him to focus entirely on achieving greatness. I was completely wrong. By removing the harsh friction of consequence, I accidentally stripped away the very resistance required to build a strong moral spine. Wealth without profound discipline is simply a highly destructive weapon. It breeds a toxic entitlement that rots a person from the inside out until they view their own family as disposable resources. The young adults working inside my community center understand the undeniable value of friction. They know that a foundation poured poorly will inevitably crack and bring down the entire house. I watch them struggle with complex wiring diagrams and heavy sheetrock. I do not step in and do the work for them. I stand back and force them to solve the structural problems using their own minds and their own sweat. Watching them finally understand a difficult concept and successfully execute a flawless weld brings an immense physical warmth to my chest. They are earning their confidence drop by drop. Earlier this afternoon, a young apprentice named Jamal approached my workstation holding a fractured piece of copper piping. He is 19 years old and comes from a deeply broken household just 3 blocks away from this facility. He stared down at his ruined project with a look of pure, absolute defeat. He quietly admitted that he rushed the soldering process because he wanted to finish the assignment ahead of the other students. He expected me to scream at him or throw him out of the program for wasting expensive raw materials. I did not raise my voice or belittle his failure. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder and explained that the pipe did not fail because the metal was defective. The pipe failed entirely because he compromised the integrity of the joint for the sake of speed. I handed him a fresh piece of copper and a wire brush. I instructed him to clean the fitting perfectly and start the grueling process completely over from the beginning. I told him that taking a shortcut will always cost you double the time and triple the pain in the long run. Jamal nodded respectfully and walked back to his station with a renewed, fierce determination in his eyes. He did not ask for pity, and he did not search for an easy way out. He simply put his safety goggles back on and ignited his torch. Seeing that young man accept his own failure and choose to rebuild his project the right way instantly reminded me of the letter sitting inside the glove compartment of my vintage truck. DeAndre has mailed me exactly 4 handwritten letters over the past 2 years. He is still working on a commercial construction crew paying off the massive federal restitution he owes to the downtown lending bank and the defrauded real estate agencies. He spends his days hauling heavy bags of cement and moving wet dirt in the bitter cold. The tone of his letters has dramatically shifted over time. The desperate, arrogant pleas for salvation have completely vanished. His latest message was entirely focused on the profound physical exhaustion he feels at the end of a 12-hour shift. He wrote that his hands are permanently scarred and his back aches relentlessly, but he is finally sleeping peacefully through the night because his conscience is clear. He is slowly, painstakingly rebuilding his own shattered character one brick at a time. I read every single word he writes, but I still have not mailed a response. I maintain the absolute silence because I know my intervention would only disrupt the delicate, necessary process of his personal redemption. If I invite him back into my life too soon, the temptation of my sprawling commercial empire might easily crush the fragile humility he is currently forging in the mud. The greatest lesson I have extracted from this entire devastating ordeal is that true lasting power relies entirely on absolute self-sufficiency. The moment you rely on another human being to validate your existence or secure your survival, you immediately hand them the keys to your destruction. I had to endure the ultimate nightmare of watching my own flesh and blood attempt to legally erase my autonomy just to fund an illusion of elite status. But walking through that fire burned away every last ounce of my own foolish complacency. I am 68 years old and I have never felt more fiercely alive or deeply connected to my true purpose. I do not spend my days sitting in a lonely dark house wondering where I went wrong. I spend my days building a permanent legacy that will continue to educate and empower this city long after I am gone. I stand in the center of the workshop and listen to the rhythmic pounding of hammers and the steady hum of heavy machinery. It is the absolute greatest symphony I have ever heard. No one can ever steal this joy from me because it is not tied to a bank account or a real estate deed. It is anchored deep within my own soul. I have learned that the respect you demand from others must first be built by your own actions every single morning without fail. If my story resonated with you, please drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you are watching from today. Hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal and taking back your life. Stay strong and never let anyone diminish your absolute worth.